Why does the Pope have a bunch of astronomers? It's a question we always get asked. And there's kind of the narrow reason. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII wanted to show the world that the church was supporting science, because at the end of the 19th century, that was just the time when the myth was becoming invented that somehow the church and science were opposed. The deeper history goes back to the fact that, in fact, the church has always supported science. You had to learn astronomy as one of the 7 courses in the medieval universities before you got to go on to theology or philosophy. The fact that there are telescopes on the Pope's summer home is a visible sign that literally the church is supporting astronomy. The important message about this support is not just to those who would criticize the church, but it's also an important message to people within the church who might be tempted to criticize science, who are suspicious of science, who want to say that all science is dangerous. That's not traditional Christianity. If you believe that God created the universe, then knowing how God created the universe is a way of getting to know God.
All right, welcome now to part 2. Now that we have some context from ancient times and ancient history, so you can see all of the various threads that have been proliferated throughout history and how they're going to be integrated into the Catholic Church, now we're going to look at the Reformation and, of course, also the Enlightenment that came afterwards. The Reformation was a key period in time because, like I said, up until the Reformation, the Catholic Church had no reason to weaponize cosmology. Even though it had all of these occult texts and occult knowledge, it had no reason to use them because it was completely dominant with an iron fist over all of Europe. So, in this part, we're going to see how heliocentrism really exploded into the Western world as a result of the Catholic Church, and how the devil subsumed all of these threads into Catholic ideals and Catholic teachings, which, of course, the catalyzing event was the Reformation, the printing of the Bibles and things like that. The Ottoman Empire was also an issue for the beast. If you have watched my End Time series, the Ottoman Empire was used to judge the beast. But of course, the beast wasn't completely to be judged because it had to live until the very end. But the Ottoman Empire was plowing away at the beast and causing problems while the Reformation was happening and printing Bibles. So this was a real crisis for the beast. And of course, it had to change tactics into how it combated the rebels and how it maintained power. And so it shifted its policy from being ruling with an iron fist to deception, to infiltration, to using secret societies, the Jesuits, and so on and so forth. They didn't have total political dominance anymore, so they had to engage in an information war. Just like the shift from Vatican I to Vatican II, how I've talked about how that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into the future of this. You'll see how that also coincides with cosmological changes. But Vatican II was a very significant repositioning of the beast. And what came out of that was a lot of false light. The charismatic movement, ecumenism, bringing people together, it was more friendly on the outside, which of course, eventually the beast will show its fangs. But The point is that the beast, understanding the beast's change of position in history really gives you a good lens to interpret everything that comes after that point. The Reformation and the Ottoman Empire judging the beast forced the beast to reposition from controlling everything with an iron fist, which is what the beast wants to get back to, by the way, with the New World Order, to engaging into more subversive information wars and doing sort of propaganda and all kinds of infiltrations, and weaponizing all of that occult knowledge that it accumulated and that the devil stockpiled in Rome. So very important to understand that as a result of that, the Jesuits were created in the early 1500s, 1534, I believe, and weaponized against the Protestant Reformation. And one of the things that was weaponized against the Protestants, there were many, was the change of cosmology. Now, very important, I skipped the medieval Dark Ages in this sequence of time because, again, the Catholic Church was dominant. There was no point in covering the medieval Dark Ages of the Catholic Church because, again, it had no reason to get involved in cosmology. So you can look into that yourself if you're so curious. But I think between covering the evolutions in Islam that happened and what the Catholic Church did, how it monitored the position of the sun and the constellations, we know how these things go. The Catholic Church knew the cosmology, but it also accumulated occult knowledge. And then eventually it realized that we need to weaponize this occult knowledge and change things in our direction so we can be the ones telling what's happening and basically tell people what to do. The devil was very hard at work during the medieval ages. Doesn't mean that he wasn't doing anything. Between 900 AD with all the Muslim stuff I just covered and 1500s with the Reformation, the devil was still extremely busy. And we know that. All of these threads would influence the development of the Counter-Reformation and the Enlightenment and all these Antichrist things that came over and over afterwards. The Counter-Reformation, then you had the French Revolution, then you had all of the Antichrist things that happened in the 1800s and the 1900s. It's just a wave and wave and wave after wave of satanic activity, which we will be documenting, and you'll get a very good taste of it today. Either way, much of modern heliocentrism was established during this time, between 1500 and 1800 AD. If you don't know what the Counter-Reformation is, then watch my End Time series so you can learn, especially the French Revolution episode. But today we are at the end of that Counter-Reformation. Almost 500 years later, we're at the end. And the Protestants have almost come back to the Mother Church. People believe largely Catholic cosmology, which leads them to embrace a new world order through climate change and through other things, ecumenical in nature. And we're at the end, folks. So this is another indicator that we are at the end of history. Now, let's see what the reformers thought about heliocentrism. This is from Christian History Institute. Did the reformers reject Copernicus? In 1539, even before Copernicus's book was printed, Martin Luther had already heard about the astronomers' theories and commented against them in the course of a dinner conversation. An eager young student copied down the critique and reported it. Quote, "There was mention of a certain new astrologer who wanted to prove that the earth moves and not the sky, the sun, and the moon. This would be as if somebody were riding on a cart or in a ship and imagined that he was standing still while the earth and the trees were moving. Keep this in mind, because this is exactly what relativism, or the special relativity through Einstein, has done to people's minds. It has made you come to the conclusion, or I should say, it makes the possibility that Luther describes here, probably not realizing he was being sarcastic, but this is exactly what relativity does. And because of that, heliocentrism has been able to hide behind a relative frame of reference. So if that doesn't make sense yet, we will make it make sense in the future. But interesting that Luther says that. Moving on. Luther remarked, so it goes now. Whoever wants to be clever must do something of his own. This is what the fellow does who wishes to turn the whole world of astronomy upside down. I believe the Holy Scriptures, for Joshua commanded the sun to stand still and not the earth." That's right. Very astute, Luther. Another student recorded it a little differently. "That fool would upset the whole art of astronomy." A punchier soundbite, this version has been widely quoted, though scholars generally believe it to be apocryphal. So that's Martin Luther. Was there anything else on this page? I don't think so. Yeah, there's a ton of... Oh, there is actually. While Lutheranism was thus condemning the theory of Earth's movement, other branches of the Protestant Church did not remain behind. Calvin took the lead in his commentary of Genesis by condemning all who asserted that the Earth is not at the center of the universe. He clinched the matter by the usual reference to the first verse of the 93rd Psalm and asked, "Who will venture to place the authority of Copernicus above that of the Holy Spirit?" This is another quote from Calvin. It says, "We will see some who are so deranged not only in religion, but who in all things reveal their monstrous nature, that they will say that the sun does not move and that it is the earth which shifts and turns. When we see such minds, we must indeed confess that the devil possesses them, and that God sets them before us as mirrors in order to keep us in his fear." John Calvin's sermon on 1 Corinthians 10, verse 19 through 24, Corpus Reformatorum. So did Calvin and Luther agree with Copernicus? No, they didn't. They saw what was happening. Maybe they didn't see the full scope of the Jesuits' plan to destroy Protestantism and bring people back to the Mother Church through cosmology. But they saw something was up that was very strange, and they rejected it. Some reformers saw these things, like Luther and Calvin, and they said were ridiculous. It's not clear if Calvin directly had an opinion on Copernicus, in the sense that the last quote that I read to you, it's not, if you dig into it, it's not clear if he was actually talking about Copernicus or just that they, basically are reading the Bible literally and commenting in general on the cosmological things happening at the time. Either way, the point is this: the Protestants eventually caved to heliocentrism. And that was through some very clever tactics of the Catholic Church, which we'll talk about with Copernicus and, what's his name? Galileo. Was it Galileo? Yeah, Galileo, I think. I feel like I'm confusing Galileo with somebody. Maybe it was Galileo. Okay, Copernicus. Copernicus and Galileo. Anyway, the Copernicus situation, it requires a lot of explanation because history is not what you've been told. And Copernicus, first off, was an occultist. And the whole thing between him and the Catholic Church was staged. And it was staged, you'll see what I mean by that, was to basically bring this heliocentric idea into the forefront. Remember, because of the Reformation and the beast losing control through grassroots movement, through the Bible being printed, through people waking up, the beast had to engage in a different tactic. It wasn't any longer a militaristic, overlord controlling every breath you take. It had to use deception. It had to use information war, in infiltration, counter-narratives, productions, enter the Jesuits. So since the Counter-Reformation began in the 1500s, you have to understand that this is the position that the beast has taken to ultimately bring the world back to total subservience under the beast as it once enjoyed. That's the whole point. And that's what the Bible warns you about when it says you won't be able to buy or sell if you don't participate in the system. So Copernicus, let's talk about Copernicus. This is his document titled Des Revolutionibus, on the revolutions, published in 1543, a couple years after the Jesuits were initiated. And if you look inside it, there's some things if you just type in, let's just type in this. This is how you find it. Visible God. Visible God. There we go. And this is on page 8 of 41 of the PDF. And he says, "What indeed is more beautiful than heaven, which of course contains all things of beauty? This is proclaimed by its very names, caelum and mundus, the latter denoting purity and ornament, the former a carving. On account of heaven's transcendent perfection, most philosophers have called it a visible God." So what is he talking about? He's talking about Hermeticism and all of the occult things that we talked about earlier. Here's another one, a little more indicative. This is from his model. Here you can see the sun. Now notice this picture. Okay, just put a pin of a tiny little dot in the middle and a circle around it, because this is an occult symbol. It's called the monad. So remember that. But this is the quote. "At rest, however, in the middle of everything is the sun. For in this most beautiful temple, who would place this lamp in another or better position than that from which it can light up the whole thing at the same time. For the sun is not inappropriately called by some people the lantern of the universe, its mind by others and its ruler by still others. Hermes, the thrice great, labels it a visible god. Now there's no doubt about what we're talking about. And Sophocles' Electra, the all-seeing. Thus, indeed, as though seated on a royal throne, the sun governs the family of planets revolving around it. Moreover, the earth is not deprived of the moon's attendance. On the contrary, as Aristotle says in a work on animal, the moon has the closest kinship with the earth. Meanwhile, the earth has intercourse with the sun, and it's impregnated for its yearly parturition. So you have the word, where is it? Most temple, beautiful temple. I can't really highlight here, but you have the word beautiful temple. Here we go. Temple, there's that. You have Hermes Trismegistus, there he is. Visible God. You have the all-seeing. You have the earth having intercourse with the sun. Are we talking about science, folks? Is this science or is this occultism? It's occultism because Copernicus was an occultist and a mystic. Very important. This is from Copernicus and the Church. What the history books don't say, from the Christian Science Monitor. Many believe the heliocentric theory was immediately rejected by the Catholic Church. However, the relationship between the Church and Copernicus is much more complex than popular historical narratives suggest. Let's find out how complex it is. Legend has it that Nicolaus Copernicus and the Church were at odds over his development of the heliocentric theory, a principle that disputed the widely held belief that the Earth was the center of the universe. Unlike Galileo and other controversial astronomers, however, Copernicus had a good relationship with the Catholic Church. It may come as a surprise considering the Church banned Copernicus's De Revolutionibus, which is what we just read, for more than 200 years. False dialectic, folks. This is a false dialectic. Copernicus was actually respected as a canon and regarded as a renowned astronomer. Contrary to popular belief, the Church accepted Copernicus's heliocentric theory before a wave of Protestant opposition led the Church to ban Copernican views in the 17th century. So what did they do? They put it out there. They see how the Protestants react. Oh, the Protestants are having a fit about it. Okay, we need to go to plan B and make it seem like we're going with the Protestants and then eventually infiltrate them and make them acknowledge this as the truth. Throughout his lifetime, Copernicus was active in the religious community. Copernicus was born in 1473 in Torun, Poland, the youngest of 4 children. At age 10, his father died and he went to live with his uncle Lucas Watson-Rode, who would later become the Bishop of Warmia, Ermland. Copernicus studied at St. John's Church in Torum's parochial school before going to Krakow Academy in 1491 to pursue astronomy and astrology. He became known as a skilled mathematical and astronomer, but he also maintained his ties to the church, obviously. He became a canon of the cathedral chapter of Frombork through his uncle, and he served the Church of Warmia as a medical advisor. Copernicus first outlined his ideas about the heliocentric theory in a manuscript titled Commentariolus. There he suggested a heliostatic system where the sun was at the center of the universe and the earth made rotations. The astronomer published De Revolutionibus in March 1543 after more than a decade of revisions. The book included a letter to Pope Paul III arguing the legitimacy of the heliocentric theory. He died 2 months later. De Revolutionibus initially met no resistance from the Catholic Church. Of course, because they had all the occult knowledge anyway. It was not until 1616 that the church banned the book. The ban continued until 1835, a couple years after the Jesuits were reinstated. Mano Singham, an associate professor of physics at Case Western University in Cleveland, Ohio, points out discrepancies between popular narratives about Copernicus and the full story. Singham published an article in Physics Today in December 2007, disputing the assumptions that Copernicus' ideas were fiercely opposed by the Catholic Church. The article, The Copernican Myths, debunks many assumptions. That people regarded Earth as the center of the universe with pride, that Earth was believed to be the center of the universe rather than at the center, that the Catholic Church immediately rejected Copernicus' findings. Copernicus' heliocentric model did receive some criticism from colleagues, but it was in part due to people's understanding of direction and of Earth's mass in relation to the universe. Singham writes, De Revolutionibus was read and at least partially taught at several Catholic universities. Remember, the Catholics were the ones who invented the university model in Rome, I believe in 1300 something, was the first university. So there's that. One possible reason for the misconceptions about Copernicus is the execution of Giordano Bruno, a philosopher who was known as a heretic and an advocate of Copernican theory. While he was condemned for other reasons, Bruno became known as the first martyr of the new science, after he was burned at the stake in 1600. However, the article also notes that Copernicus gained ridicule from poets and Protestants, who condemned it as a heresy. We saw a few examples with Luther and Calvin. While the Catholic Church initially accepted heliocentricity, Catholics eventually joined the wave of Protestant opposition and banned the book in 1616. See the problem? God forbid that they start losing people over this. The Protestant churches accepted Copernicus's findings after more evidence emerged to support it. There you go. Counter-Reformation at work. The Catholic Church, however, remained ground in its anti-Copernican beliefs until the 19th century. The ban on Copernicus's views were lifted in 1822, and the ban on his book not until 1835. It is worth noting, as Stanford University does, that the Catholic Church had no official stance on Copernican teachings. Pope Clement VII, who died about a decade before Copernicus, was said to have been receptive about the astronomer's theories. While there was no recorded response from Pope Paul III, one of his advisors intended to condemn the book before dying. Phil Lawler, editor of the Catholic World News, also says Copernicus was in good standing with the Church when he died. That's what you should know. He notes that while heliocentric theory was controversial during Copernicus' lifetime, his work did not cause him any conflict with the Catholic Church. No conflict with the Catholic Church, even though there's this big drama that people know about, and the question is why? Well, hopefully you'll find out why in today's episode. Yes, he delayed because he feared an adverse reaction, not from church leaders, but from his fellow scholars. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that Copernicus was worried about a hostile reaction from the church. Despite the resistance to Copernican views in the future, the astronomer's life was one immersed in religion. Well, we know what religion that was from the way that he wrote, don't we? And while it may be forgotten, it is under the auspices of the Catholic Church that Copernicus made his theories known. That's right, folks. History is not what you think it is. And the snake has been very, very, very clever. Let's see. Anthem to the Sun, I think, is the next thing I wanted to read you. By Christopher Helton, PhD, philosopher and owner of Paracelsus LLC. This is an article he wrote on LinkedIn in August of 2017, titled Anthem to the Sun, Copernicus. On the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, Copernicus puts forth an alternate cosmological order than Ptolemy's system. Instead of the Earth being the center of the solar system, the Sun is the center, and the Earth rotates around the Sun. Copernicus believes this hypothesis will eliminate several problems associated with the Ptolemaic system. Astronomers who follow Ptolemy are uncertain about the motion of the Sun and Moon, and they cannot establish a constant length even for a tropical year. You can if you know the actual calendar, but there's that. Secondly, they are not consistent in explaining the motions of the other 5 planets. They use homocentric motion, while others use eccentrics and epicycles to explain the rotation of the 5 other planets. To overcome these problems, Copernicus offers alternate hypotheses about the planets, which has roots with the ancient Pythagoreans. Quote, Philolaus and Pythagorean believes that, like the sun and the moon, it revolves around the fire in an oblique circle. Heraclides of Pontus and Ecphantus of the Pythagorean make the earth move, not in a progressive motion, but like a wheel in rotation from west to east about its center. Copernicus 5. This is the document we just read, I think page 5. So where did Copernicus get his ideas from? Pythagoras. What was Pythagoras all about? Well, we know what he was about. He's about the occult. Copernicus' reference to Pythagoreans is meant to add credibility to his heliocentric hypothesis because his view is not new, but maintained by the ancient Pythagoreans, whose works have been recently recovered from antiquity. That's right, leapfrog. His heliocentric hypothesis does not only have Pythagorean roots, but also Hermetic. We may recall Ficino's first usage of the microcosm and macrocosm analogy involves the imagery of the sun and heart, which directly comes from the Hermetica. Copernicus likewise speaks of the special role that the sun has in the Hermetica. Quote, "For the sun is not inappropriately called by some people of the lantern of the universe, its mind by others, and its ruler. Hermes the thrice great labels it a visible god." This is what we just read in his writings. Accordingly, we have two historical roots for Copernicus' heliocentric hypothesis: the Pythagoreans and Hermes. Since pre-moderns believe incorrectly that Hermes predated the Pythagoreans, Copernicus would have believed that the idea that the sun is the center of the solar system and the other 7 planets' spheres rotate around her come from Hermes and pass down to the Pythagoreans as a secret of nature. Accordingly, Hermes is the initial source or root of the heliocentric hypothesis. We find Hermes in the 15th century Florentines, Servetus, the German spiritual rationalists, Calvin, Porta, Gilbert, and Bruno. Now, we find Hermes as a root of the Copernican hypothesis, which modernity regards as the first move towards modernity, but is really a return to the Hermetic and Pythagorean beliefs about the cosmos. It's a return, folks. It's a return. Remember, the Reformation was a real thorn in the beast's side. So it's got to weaponize all of that mystery religion and occult knowledge that it has. It's a return to the mystery schools. Copernicus begins constructing his heliocentric cosmology with a macro and micro analogy. Just as the cosmos is a sphere, so are the celestial planet spheres. Now, is that true? Is that scientific, or is that just philosophy? Would you look at, if you went into a house and you looked at the roof and it's a vaulted ceiling, would you look at the roof and say, gosh, the floor must be like that too? How about you just look at the floor and see what the floor looks like, instead of looking at the roof to tell you what the floor looks like? Unlike Bruno, Copernicus does not believe the cosmos to be infinite, but a closed sphere. He believes that sphere is the best structure for 2 reasons. Let's see, are they scientific or are they occult? Of all the forms, first of all, the sphere is the most perfect. Quote, "needing no joint and being a complete whole, which can neither be increased nor diminished." Does that sound like Plato? Well, if you've read about Plato and his obsession with spheres, then yeah, it's exactly Plato. Plato's ideas coming through Copernicus. This is on page 8 of his writings. A spherical structure to cosmos may have hermetic roots. Hermes claims the cosmos is created by God as a great sphere. Entering the craftsman's sphere and learning well their essence and sharing their nature, the man wished to break through the circumference of the circles to observe the rule of the one given power over fire. This is some Hermetic writing, page 3. Hermes claims that all the planets are spheres. The truly wise to break through their respective spheres in order to see the sun. So you have to transcend, you have to break through that firmament to see the truth. But again, the Bible doesn't talk about spheres. The Bible doesn't tell you spheres. It just tells you the sun and the moon and the stars. There are no planets. It just says sun, moon, and stars. And each of those things is different. The sun is different from the moon. The moon is different from the stars. They're all very unique things. And of course, we can talk about some of those things as we go through this, but nevertheless, there's no such thing as a planet. There are luminaries. There's some sort of star or planet, or not planet, but luminary. It's just hard to get out of your vocabulary after 30 plus years of watching Star Trek. But anyway, moving on. Copernicus' second reason for making the cosmos a sphere is the most capacious of figures, best suited to retain and enclose all things. Is this a scientific argument, or is it a philosophical argument? It's a philosophical argument. Well, the sphere is this perfect shape, and it's a perfect container, so the heavens must be a sphere. The universe must be a sphere. Hermes' comments about how hard it is to break through the circumference of the spheres negatively reinforces Copernicus' point that the sphere is the best form for the universe, because the sphere is the best at retaining and enclosing celestial spheres, the sun, the moon, the earth, and so on. Just as the cosmos is a sphere, the earth is a sphere, because the earth pressed upon its center from every direction. Page 8 on Copernicus' writings. So, there's more to read on this, but I think you get the point, and you can read on it yourself. This is the monad I told you to remember. Remember that little diagram that he had with the celestial spheres? There's the sun at the middle. And for them, you have to break through the spheres to get to the center and to be one with the sun, which is, of course, this is the symbol for the monad. As they use in the cosmic philosophy and cosmogony to refer to the most basic original substance, as originally conceived by who? Pythagoreans. The monad is the supreme being, divinity, or the totality of all things. But the monad also represents the sun in the heliocentric system. So I wonder if there's a relationship there. According to some philosophers of the early modern period, most notably Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, there are infinite monads, which are the basic and immaterial elementary particles or simplest units that make up the universe. Yeah, science or philosophy. Historical background. According to Hippolytus, the worldview was inspired by Pythagoreans, who called the first thing that came into existence the monad, which begat or bore the dyad, which begat the numbers, which begat the point, begetting lines or finiteness, etc. It meant divinity, the first being, or the totality of all beings, referring in cosmogony, creation theories, variously to source acting alone and or an indivisible origin and equivalent comparators. Pythagorean and Neoplatonic philosophers like Plotinus and Porphyry condemned Gnosticism for its treatment of the monad. In his Latin treatise Maximae Theologiae, Alan of Lisle affirms God as an intelligible sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. The French philosopher Rabelais ascribed this proposition to Hermes Trismegistus. There he is again, our friend Hermes, the counterfeit Christ, telling you about the monad. So this monad, remember, in De Revolutionibus of, what's his name? Copernicus, where he was talking about the sun being the visible God. And he had this diagram of the monad. Of course, it had more circles inside of it to denote the heavenly spheres that the various planets were orbiting. And the sun was at the middle. And the monad to the Pythagoreans, who influenced Copernicus, represents the ultimate being, the source that you need to be one with. So, of course, what does it tell you? That means this is a sun-worshipping system. Of course, this also is also a symbol for a phallus, for Baal, for basically esoteric sex worship and sun worship and Baal and so on and so forth. So, conclusion. Well, we'll talk more about the circle map and why it's wrong, because you can see also a relationship between the circle map and the monad, which tells me very plainly that the circle movement is just narrative and counter-narrative, as usual. The devil controls both sides to prevent you from getting to the truth. And we'll talk more about that in the next episode of the series. But conclusion, Copernicus was an occultist. That's very well documented. And he was also very neck deep in the Catholic Church and never had an issue with the Catholic Church, contrary to popular belief. But he based his views on the occult and on mysticism from Hermes Trismegistus, from the Pythagorean mystery traditions. He is very influenced by alchemy and all these things. Very obvious, very, very plainly obvious with anybody with a shred of discernment. The Protestants were initially skeptical of Copernicus because of his ties to the papacy. So the Catholic Church staged this conflict to lower the guard of the Protestants. They made it appear as if they're against this cosmology. No, we're with the Bible. We reject this cosmology, to make the Protestants and the Catholics who were going with the Protestants believe that, the Catholic Church isn't that apostate. So this was just a smokescreen to get people to lower their guard so that eventually the Protestants could be infiltrated and persuaded to move into the heliocentric idea. Because as you'll see, as we go through this, the heliocentric idea is they're not just changing cosmology just to change cosmology. The point of all things, folks, all roads lead to Rome. The point of all things is to bring you back to the Mother Church, back to that 1,000-year period in the Dark Ages or so, give or take, before the Reformation, before all these things happened, the French Revolution, where the beast enjoyed total and utter supremacy over your life. That is the goal of all things. So you have to follow the breadcrumb trail, and you will see in this particular video, in this presentation, that the heliocentric model was designed to ultimately bring people back to the Catholic Church. And it's truly profound how they do this on such large timescales. That proves to you they're not doing it of themselves. They are listening to the powers of evil, and they are in communion with the devil himself. But nevertheless, the Catholic Church puffed up a smokescreen. You'll see with Galileo as well. They did the same exact thing to basically make this drama that seems that the Catholic Church is against, we're against this new stuff, to let the guard of the Catholics down, who were with the Protestants, to let the Protestant guard come down and eventually infiltrate and come back and bring them back to a common way of thinking. And then also to accomplish, you'll see also to accomplish the goal of demonizing anybody, once the shift has been made from dark to light, once the Protestants have embraced heliocentrism, then the church can come along, but it's been delayed on purpose so that once the church officially embraces heliocentrism, all those, basically rebels like you and me who believe that the Bible is true and that biblical cosmology is not heliocentrism, that heliocentrism is an occult cosmology, that all of these people can now be demonized as fools, as archaic, as being, oh, well, what are you, reading the Bible literally, that kind of thing. Even today, Answers in Genesis, which is a creationist platform, is heliocentric. They're afraid to stand up for the truth. And that tells you everything. That tells you exactly that the Counter-Reformation is right on schedule. So the Catholic Church did these little shenanigans with Copernicus in order to, in the short term, make the Protestants and the Catholics who were going with them in opposition let down their guard so that Jesuit infiltrations could happen and more evidence could be presented, and eventually everybody would believe. And the second goal for that, which was more long-term, was that once this shift had been accomplished in the Protestant world and people had gone with the Catholic Church's cosmology, then anybody who stood up for biblical cosmology could be demonized and say, oh, you're believing wrong cosmology. We've believed about this through science and, for hundreds of years. Don't be archaic like the Catholic Church used to be, that kind of thing. It's very clever. It's very, very clever. The issue with Copernicus wasn't even whether it was flat or a ball or not. It was geocentricity, meaning is the Earth in the center or is the sun in the center? A moving Earth versus a stationary Earth, which is the Ptolemaic system. It was a publicity stunt to bring heliocentrism and cosmology to the forefront of debates. Just like how they do today, folks, where they put, something to clog the news cycle with the whole P. Diddy thing, or the war in Ukraine, or the war in Israel, or whatever. All these things that keep happening to get you to go chit-chat, 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 and to shape the culture. Of course, they can do it much faster now with the internet, but they've been doing this for a long time. And this is exactly what they did with Copernicus. They brought this debacle to the front, what seemed like a debacle, because again, Copernicus died, he was on good standing with the church and he was very neck deep in the church's institution. But they brought this forward and they made this seem like a debacle, which is very, very interesting, very, very telling thing about their methods. Now, another thing that's important is to remember that Copernicus had a very comfortable life. He was never punished. He was never persecuted. The Catholic Church never had an official stance on his theories. So what does that tell you? That tells you some very important things. Copernicus did his part. And then Galileo came and made other changes. Protestants eventually accepted Rome's cosmology through these various waves and generations. You see, this is what they do. They put one guy out there, they ping, and they test the response. Okay, it goes this way, let's go that way. Let's put another guy, test the response. And they shape it like this. They shape culture one person after another, and when they're done with them, they just stage a debacle, or they kill that person, or whatever else. Nothing new under the sun. This has been the devil's dark and light tactics from the very beginning. Now, they also created a precedent, again, to demonize people who are holding on to any kind of religious fundamentalism, because after the Catholic Church officially embraced Copernicus's teachings, now all those Protestants who were left, who rejected all these Catholic attempts to change cosmology, now you could be legitimately demonized. Because in the beginning, you can't demonize the Protestant world, because everybody believed the Bible. Do you see how clever they were? So they had to make it seem like, it's taken us a long time to come to this. Of course, Rome is the seat of the occult, so they already believed these things. But they made it seem as if it took them a long time to come to terms with Copernicus's theories. So that when they finally did it, and the last haul through the 1800s, we'll talk about the 1800s, it's a very satanic century. And the 1900s, the last push towards this New World system, when that started to come, when the Jesuits were reinstated, now we can weaponize this and officially embrace it so that all the Protestants who are left, they're going to look like fools and we can demonize them and discredit them very easily to their peers. That's the whole point. So if you're a Protestant, folks, or if you call yourself a Protestant, then you need to protest all of the Catholic Church's teachings. And you need to realize that heliocentrism, whether you want to accept that or not, is a Catholic, really mystery religion teaching. But of course, again, the devil gave the Catholic Church's power, so it's Catholic cosmology. So don't be afraid of looking like a fundamentalist and being accused of being a fool or whatever else by embracing what the Bible tells you. But either way, this is where we're at. The Catholic Church made itself seem as the persecutor through this debacle with Copernicus and also with Galileo. You'll see a very interesting video from a Jesuit talking about it. The Catholic Church made itself seem like the persecutor who saw the light of the heliocentric system. But in fact, it was a deception. It's false. They were controlling both sides as usual. Do you get the marvelous evil that the devil was doing to bring the Protestants into accepting the heliocentric model by rejecting it at first and making it seem like it took hundreds of years, and then finally the Catholic Church abandoned its old ways of thinking. So don't be like that. Don't be like the old Catholic Church. Just profoundly evil and profoundly gaslighting. Again, the Jesuits were reinstated in 1812. In 1822, the Roman Catholic Church actively began its involvement in cosmology by legitimizing Copernicus's writings, and then I think, was it 1834 or something? They officially embraced it. And so you see these things coming to light after the resurrection of the Jesuits, I should say the reinstatement, because they always were around. And eventually you'll see, once we get to the next section of this, the 1800s, how it all just proliferated from there. The final assault and takeover after Copernican theory was officially accepted by the Roman Catholic Church. Very fascinating thing. Now, let's talk about a few more of these occultists. Newton, Paracelsus, Galileo, Brahe, and Linnaeus. This is from Vox from 2015. These 5 men were scientific geniuses. They also thought magic was real. You don't say. Let's see. And it didn't keep my highlights, so I think I'm just going to read everything. Galileo is quoted by saying, "Where the senses fail us, reason must step in." Then again, he also made astrological charts for rich people. Throughout history, scientific geniuses from Galileo to Newton have often believed in completely fantastical things, from astrology to alchemy to straight-up magic. Yet some of their bizarre ideas seemed completely valid to them at the time, and often for good reasons. We have the benefit of hindsight today, which gives us an unfair advantage over these geniuses. But that doesn't make their belief systems any less weird. Let's take a look. Number 1, Galileo believed astrology changed everything. Today, Galileo is held up as a paragon of rationality. He advocated heliocentrism, the idea that the sun, not the earth, was at the center of the solar system, fought an anti-heliocentric church at great risk, and greatly advanced astronomy throughout Europe. Remember, these are dialectics, we'll expose them. He was also something like that of a fortune teller. Galileo didn't just believe in astrology, he practiced it, conducted it for wealthy clients, and taught it to medical students. If students at the University of Padua had taken MCAT, Galileo would have included a question about whether Leo should date a Gemini. Galileo wasn't alone in keeping up on his signs. His contemporary, Johannes Kepler, conducted his own astrological studies, though more reluctantly, he called people who believed in astrology fatheads. Isaac Newton thought alchemy was the future. Isaac Newton, beneath the wig, a brain buzzing about alchemy. John Maynard Keynes called Isaac Newton the last of the great magicians, with good reason. Newton spent half of his life obsessed with alchemy, the transformative magic most frequently associated with turning different metals into gold. To make things even more complicated, in 1696, Newton became warden of the mint, and he became master of the mint in 1700. The Royal Mint, of course, makes the coins for the entire United Kingdom, which was formed in 1707, 7 years into Newton's appointment. To be clear, an alchemist was the person in charge of making all the money. Newton wasn't the only respected mind who had visions of diving into gold coins. Robert Boyle is considered the father of chemistry, but he dabbled in alchemy as well. In fact, he was so committed to the alchemical cause that he fought to make alchemy legal. since Henry IV had banned it because alchemy wasn't good for the monetary supply. Needless to say, the repeal wasn't necessary. The Philosopher's Stone Newton chased after wasn't only able to cure metals that weren't gold, it also had medical powers that fascinated Newton and his peers. Unfortunately, today you can only find the Philosopher's Stone in the British subtitle of the first Harry Potter book. Yeah, and this is what modern technology is doing today, folks. Just a quick pause. You have to understand that technology is based around this idea that you can be like God. Everything and all the technological marvels and advancements that have come across, like having a little cell phone that can do anything for you, is a pursuit of alchemy, of transforming man into God and ultimately becoming transhuman. Transhumanism is alchemy 2.0, really. It's alchemy in the modern age, fusing with technology so that you could have everything and be a god. So these things are nothing new. The packages have changed, but you can see throughout history all these people were occultists. Number 3 on this list, Tycho Brahe made everyone believe he was a sorcerer. Tycho Brahe created his own model of the universe, and though he didn't get things quite right, he helped advance astronomy and cataloged more than 1,000 stars. Well, there you go. He also convinced everyone he was a sorcerer. He did so from, what does the Bible say, by the way, about sorcerers? He did so from the unique perch of his private sorcerer's island, Hveen, known today as English as Ven. Fantastically wealthy, Brahe built multiple observatories there and had a squad of astronomical assistants, and used tiny automata robots to convince the locals he had magical powers. It didn't hurt that he partied hard and had his nose partly sliced off in a duel and his pet moose drunk at parties. He didn't just hoodwink the public into believing he was magical, he believed it too. He publicly lectured against anyone who believed astrology was fake, and he also believed alchemy was the future for mystical discoveries. Brahe even became so synonymous with magic that an entire calendar of magical days was made in his honor, and his name was slapped on to give it magical credibility. So these people were eccentric, wealthy occultists, nothing new under the sun. Carl Linnaeus classified magical animals like the Hydra and believed in mermaids. Carl Linnaeus, 1707 to 1778, imposed taxonomical order on animal and plant life. In his era, scientists were discovering all sorts of new species at a rapid clip. Linnaeus himself thought pelicans might be a myth. That rapid pace of discovery led Linnaeus to believe, perhaps reasonably though, that humans would soon find a host of mythological animals. Linnaeus devoted a whole section of his landmark Systema Naturae to these strange beasts. It was called Animalia Paradoxa, and it included the Hydra, the Satyrus, a monkey-like man similar to Pan in Greek mythology, the Phoenix, the bird that rose from the ashes. Did Linnaeus believe in these animals? It's hard to know, and some of Linnaeus' defenders may only include the animals to point out how absurd they were. In 1730s, he became famous for debunking a Hydra in Hamburg. However, we can reasonably claim that Linnaeus believed he'd found a troglodyte, was pretty confident he'd seen a unicorn, and was very excited at the chance to find a mermaid. Whatever the motivation, Linnaeus wasn't alone in believing in bizarre, vaguely magical animals. Gottfried Leibniz managed to help invent calculus, and yet he still wanted to fill a museum with weird and imaginary animals like the myrmecolon, some sort of antlion. Paracelsus loved natural magic and himself. Paracelsus looked slightly confused. Oh yeah, in the picture he's painting. Paracelsus did a lot when he was alive, including basically inventing toxicology and naming zinc. But when he wasn't revolutionizing scientific methods and naming metals, he was a big fan of magical things. Born as Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, he renamed himself Paracelsus, both because it was shorter and because it literally meant he was better than Celsus, a first-century Roman medical researcher. In Paracelsus' defense, he may have been renamed by his biggest fans. Paracelsus wrote that from an early age, the transmutation of metals was his obsession, and he pursued it with vigor as an adult. When he wasn't traveling the world performing surgeries, he tried to utilize natural magic to help patients. He was quoted as saying, "Magic is a great secret wisdom," and while his understanding of natural magic occasionally lent itself to scientific inquiry, he also believed that the soul strongly desires sulfur. As the scientist on the list closest to him in time to Aristotle, it makes sense that Paracelsus would indulge in magic and the occult. Oh, it makes total sense. In his defense, the belief in magic was grounded in a commitment to inquiry. Paracelsus thought magic was just science and wasn't understood yet. In a way, that unites all scientists on this list who pursued new knowledge even when it meant looking into some very unusual places. Of course, some apology there about all these things, but these people are blind to the fact that these people, these scientists, were occultists. They were occultists. They were influenced by the occult. They were obsessed with the occult. And of course, all of the science that they did do was in order to promote and advance in their occult ideas and esoteric thoughts. This is from a documentary which I highly recommend called Heliosorcery. And it's very good. You can watch it. I don't know if it's on YouTube anymore, but it's certainly on BitChute. You can watch the whole thing. Very good historical document, especially documentation of the Reformation and all the things we're talking about today. But we're going to watch from about 44 to 47, about 3 minutes of this, just to get a little good history. Oh, if I can get it. There it is. Let's see what speed it is. Speed 1.5. Let's get regular speed. And here we go.
Is my friend. News of the heliocentrist being persecuted for his beliefs spread throughout Europe. As Jesuit astronomer Guy Consolmagno admits regarding the trial of Galileo, it's not what you think it is.
One thing that I do want to say about Galileo, 3 points. Galileo was a devout Catholic even after
This guy's a Jesuit, so pay attention.
his trial. Galileo was actually never convicted of being a heretic. The conviction that when they said, we found you guilty of heresy, you can read the transcript of the trial. It's not what you think it is. It's Galileo saying, what did I do wrong? I'll change it, please. And they're saying, no, sorry, we can't let you do that. Very odd. At the end, they said, so we found you guilty of heresy. It looks like they had written the verdict before the trial even began. And Galileo said, well, actually, you never did find me guilty of any heresy. So he was found guilty of vehement suspicion of heresy. And the famous scene where he has to abjure his teachings, what he actually says is, and in rites and signs, is, I reject anything and everything in my writings which is contrary to the teachings of the church, without ever specifying any of those things. I mean, he could have been a Jesuit, right?
He could have been a Jesuit, right? From a Jesuit.
It cannot be said that Galileo was teaching anything contrary to the teachings of the church. The heliocentric theory had been summoned up from obscurity by one of her own clerics, and then published at the request of Rome's highest-ranking cardinals 70 years earlier. Guy Consolmagno drops a few clues as to what the Galileo affair was really about.
Nobody knows really why Galileo was gone after. For most of Galileo's life, he was lionized. He was treated like a hero, including by people in the church. When Galileo got into trouble at the end of his life, it was a real shock. It was a complete reversal of everything that had been said up to that point. And so the historical question is, why did it happen? And the answer is, we don't know. You can go to Amazon.com and find 300 books on Galileo, every one of them with a different answer, which is to say there was something going on, and it wasn't simply a science versus religion thing. If you relied on JFK the movie to figure out what happened in the assassination of Kennedy, you'd be in as good shape. You've got to remember, the Galileo affair occurred at the height of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War.
By comparing the Galileo affair to a conspiratorial account of the JFK assassination, Consolmagno reiterates the point, it's not what you think it is. Reading between the lines, this Jesuit priest is telling us that the whole event was a conspiracy, orchestrated by Rome, that took place at the height of the Reformation.
The way we use the word misdirection is...
Very good documentary, by the way. This Heliosorcery. I highly recommend checking it out. It's very good history. specifically about the Reformation and how the Catholic Church basically took over and all the things we're talking about today. But you can see there's something really strange, isn't there? Something really strange about the whole drama with Copernicus and Galileo. Both of them were very much in favor with the church. And then suddenly with the Counter-Reformation, you see these dramas coming into the forefront where it seems like the Catholic Church is the aggressor, the persecutor that is, not wanting to see the light of new science. But it doesn't actually persecute these people. It's all a show. It's all a theater. And of course, if you know that the Jesuits are the ones who invented modern theater, they really perfected the art of acting and theater, and they created something called the magic candle. It was a Jesuit who invented that. Basically a projector onto a wall. They created that. And they had all the theaters of Europe. And so the Jesuits, one of the weapons of the Counter-Reformation has been learning against learning through theater. Theater. The world is a stage, said Shakespeare, who was probably a Jesuit or a fake person that was maybe multiple Jesuits writing and they all wrote under the name Shakespeare. Who knows? But nevertheless, Shakespeare tells you the world is a stage. That's a very important statement because it reveals to you the devil's means and methods. These are staged things, folks. They were staged in order to make first off, again, cosmology be the forefront. Be in the forefront. What's going on? Oh my gosh, did you see Galileo? He's getting persecuted. Cosmology. Why? Is the sun in the center or is the earth in the center? This is designed to get people to talk. To see, first off, which way do people go? How much do we need to work to infiltrate the Protestant Reformation in order to bring them back to the church? Okay, well, there's a lot of people going this way and some of the Catholics going with them. So, okay, let's leave Copernicus alone. Let's get Galileo. Okay, people are still going. We need to infiltrate a little more. Leave Galileo alone. Let's get some more, and so on and so forth. You get these various dialectical schemes, and the devil is monitoring the reaction of the people and infiltrating more and more until it's the perfect time to switch. And in the process, they have demonized anybody who chooses to remain with the Bible and to read the Bible literally, by pointing to, look at those archaic beliefs that the Catholic Church, believed and persecuted Galileo and Copernicus. Well, wait a minute. Galileo and Copernicus were high-ranking Catholic operatives. They weren't persecuted. It was all just a show. And even a Jesuit tells you, he could have been a Jesuit, right? A little smirk and everybody's laughing. I mean, why are they laughing? Because they know the truth, dang it. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. So anyway, I recommend that documentary. This is a book by Graham Hancock, who, of course, he's a little more new agey, but eat the meat, spit out the bones. He documents some important things. It's called The Sign and the Seal. And we're going to see if we can read. Where is this? Okay, found it. This was actually a little challenging because the link I had put in was a search query and I needed to actually look up the page. It was, for some reason, it wasn't displaying the pages, but this is page 334 to 335 in Graham Hancock's book, The Sign and the Seal. And we're going to begin right at the top of 334. A far more convincing explanation, however, was given by Dr. Hugh Schoenfield, an expert on early Christianity who had deciphered a secret code used in a number of famous Dead Sea Scrolls. A code that the Templars might easily have learned during their long residence in the Holy Land, which I talk about in my Masoretic PSYOP. Very interesting correlations there. Moving on, Dr. Schoenfield showed that if the name Baphomet were written in this code and then transliterated, the result would be the Greek word Sophia. And the Greek word Sophia in its turn meant nothing more or less than wisdom. By this analysis, therefore, when the Templars worshipped Baphomet, what they were really doing was worshiping the principle of wisdom. And that, of course, was exactly what the ancient Egyptians had done when they had worshipped Thoth as the personification of the mind of God. Are we talking about counterfeit Christ here? Yes, we are. As the author of every work on every branch of knowledge, both human and divine. The Bible tells you that Jesus is the Word of God and is the exact imprint of his nature and is the source of all wisdom. But Hermes is claiming to be that, and so these people are worshiping Baphomet and Sophia and Hermes and all these different names for a counterfeit Christ. work on every branch of knowledge, both human and divine, and as the inventor of astronomy and astrology, the science of numbers and mathematics, geometry, and the land of surveying, medicine, botany. I was encouraged to look further. One fact which quickly came to light was that the Freemasons had also held Thoth in special regard. Indeed, according to a very old Masonic tradition, Thoth had played a major part in preserving knowledge of the Mason craft and transmitting it to mankind after the flood. And the author of a well-researched academic study on the origins of Freemasonry went so far as to say that, in their early days, the Masons had regarded Thoth as their patron. I was already aware, see Chapter 7, that close links had existed between the Templars and the Freemasons. There you go, I'm not the only one telling you that. With the latter almost certainly being descended from the former. Now I could see that what I was coming to think of as the Thoth connection set those links in the ancient and enduring context of a wisdom tradition stretching back to pharaonic times. Yeah, it's all one big club, folks. It's the mystery religion of the ages, Mystery Babylon. I therefore asked myself this: in addition to the Templars and the Masons, had there been any other groups or individuals whose works and ideas had appeared unusually advanced and who might possibly have been initiates in the same wisdom tradition? I found that there had been many. For example, Copernicus, the Renaissance astronomer whose theory of a heliocentric universe had overturned the Earth-centered complacency of the Middle Ages, had said quite openly that he had arrived at his revolutionary insights by studying the secret writings of the ancient Egyptians, including the hidden works of Thoth himself. Likewise, the 17th century mathematician Kepler, who amongst other things compiled an imaginary account of a trip to the moon, admitted that in formulating his laws of the planetary orbits, he was merely stealing the golden vessels of the Egyptians. All those people, all those heroes of heliocentrism that are propped up to you as these marvelously scientific geniuses are nothing more than just occultists that are slaves to the devil. In a similar vein, Sir Isaac Newton stated in his view that the Egyptians concealed mysteries that were above the capacity of the common herd under the veil of religious rites and hieroglyphic symbols. Is this the same case with the Catholic Church today? Of course it is. Among these mysteries, he believed, was the knowledge that the earth orbited the sun and not vice versa. It was the most ancient opinion that the planets revolved about the sun, and the earth, as one of the planets, described an annual course about the sun, while by a diurnal motion it turned on its axis and the sun remained at rest. Newton's profound intellect and scholarship had enabled him to lay the foundations of physics as a modern discipline. His specific achievements had included an epoch-making discoveries in mechanics, optics, astronomy, and mathematics, the binomial theorem, and the differential and integral equations in calculus. Huge steps forward in the understanding of the nature of light and, above all else, the formulation of the universal law of gravitation, which had altered forever mankind's vision of the cosmos, which is true. What was much less well known about the great English scientist, however, was the fact that he had spent a significant part of his adult life deeply immersed in hermetic and alchemical literature. More than a tenth of his personal library had been taken up with alchemical treatises. Furthermore, he had been literally obsessed with the notion that a secret wisdom lay concealed within the pages of the scriptures. Daniel of the Old Testament and John of the New Testament particularly attracted him because of the language of the prophetic writings was symbolic and hieroglyphical, and their comprehension required a radically different method of interpretation. No, you just use the Bible to interpret itself, but if you're a Gnostic looking for secret knowledge, you're going to love that kind of stuff and twist it into all sorts of things, just like Helena Blavatsky did, and like all of these people did. But Graham Hancock, a researcher in all of these ancient histories and ancient texts, what does he tell you? Kepler, Newton, and Copernicus were all very neck deep in the devil's soup. This is from also the Wayback Machine, because they took this down for some reason. Mythcrafts, our playground for all things mythic. It's from Mythcrafts. It's a link that I had to put into the Wayback Machine to find, because they took it down. But the Wayback Machine is very useful. This is from 2017. Isaac Newton and the Emerald Tablet. Sir Isaac Newton has been referred to as the last of the great magicians and the first of the great scientists. The truth of this statement can be found in his copious notes on alchemy, which rival his works on calculus, optics, and gravitation. Now, it can be argued that during his lifetime science was alchemy, and there is truth to that claim. However, the ground rules of alchemy contain many magical assumptions about the nature of reality. Yeah, heliocentrism is magical too. Assumptions that simply do not fit in with what we now call the scientific method. Let's consider the so-called philosopher's stone, the goal of alchemy. Its primary purpose is transforming lead into gold. While the notion of searching for the philosopher's stone as a psychological quest still exists, as Carl Jung being a prime proponent, the idea of producing a physical object that can transform baser elements into gold is an idea whose time has long gone. Today's science can transform those base metals into gold. It merely takes a particle accelerator and a lot of money, somewhere on the order of $1 quadrillion per ounce. Blah, blah, blah. It's either that or you have to wait for modern physics' own unobtainable quest, cold fusion. Back to Sir Isaac. His goal was to create a working philosopher's stone. So where does one start? With the father of alchemy, the fabled Hermes Trismegistus, and his just as mysterious text of 14 lines called the Emerald Tablet. Alchemists and occultists up through the Victorian age took his authorship at face value, placing its origins in antiquity a product of Hellenic Egyptian magic. Less romantically and more historically, it was probably written between 6th and 8th centuries in Arabic. Though to be a compendium, thought to be a compendium of earlier works, it went under the title Kitab Sir al-Halika, Book of the Secret of Creation and the Art of Nature. Newton himself would be working from a Latin translation of the Arabic original. Here is a Newton's translation of the Emerald Tablet into English, currently housed at King's College Library in Cambridge University. We read that earlier in Wikipedia, but Newton translated the Emerald Tablet. He was so into that stuff that he translated the Emerald Tablet into English, which is very interesting. So, conclusions with all of these things. Well, we still have some more to go, but as you can see, Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler and all these people were occultists. Copernicus and Galileo specifically were staged to make the Catholic Church look good and to demonize people who would cling to the truth once the psyop was complete. So that took about 200 years or so, but cosmology was brought to the forefront. People started arguing. Protestants went this way, Catholics went that way. Some Catholics went with the Protestants. Infiltrations happened, more propaganda, more science, more people, and eventually you had the dark to light in cosmology in the Protestant world. And once that was complete, the church finally came along and abandoned its old ways. And now anybody who stands against that looks like a heretic, looks like, you're a fool. How could you possibly believe the earth is flat? And so on and so forth. All of the major figures were occultists and influenced by the mystery religion. They weren't just indirectly influenced. They were participating in it, folks. That's something you need to realize. They were not born-again Christians seeking the glory of a sovereign God. They were occultists. Newton, quote-unquote, discovered gravity in 1666, which is very interesting that he found it in that year. But of course, gravity doesn't exist. Watch my 20 Reasons Gravity is a Fraud video. Newton was also a mystic, and he was involved with alchemy. He got his ideas from the Emerald Tablet and all these mystery religions. Satan kept bringing it to one person to another, and using his little leapfrog method with all of these places and transferring the secret knowledge, which is really just a deception, from one generation to another. None of these men were pure scientists because science was always tied to spirituality. And people don't realize that, but the notion of atheism and secularity and secularism is only about 250 years old since the French Revolution. Science and spirituality, before that, for thousands of years, were one pursuit until that time. And they are one pursuit. In truth, they are one pursuit. This is the thing to understand. There's no such thing as atheistic science. This was designed as a false dialectic to ultimately bring people back to the beast, which is what you're seeing now. You're seeing climate change become a moral issue. Climate change I've talked about this in my Dark to Light playlist, but climate change used to be this liberal atheistic thing. Now, it's a moral thing. You got to do it for God. You got to rest on Sunday for God because he entrusted you with the environment. Otherwise, you're breaking God's laws. So now we're full circle where science and spirituality are linked back together. But it was necessary to split science and spirituality into two so that it could come back again, just like the French Revolution started communism on the left and religious nationalism on the right, the two-party system. It's all dialectics, folks. But the point is that science and spirituality should be one thing, because ultimately God created the universe, God created our minds, God gave us the ability to be analytical, and science is the discovery of God's marvelous works and marveling at God. So yeah, science and spirituality should be connected. But because these people worship the devil and they're doing the devil's spirituality, they are hijacking science and fusing it with delusion and deception and occult practice. And they did that for, thousands of years. So you have to realize that heliocentrism came out of that. It didn't come out of some atheistic, purely, material way of measuring the universe. It came out of a false counterfeit spirituality with a false Christ, which is Hermes Trismegistus, which these people worshipped as a false Christ, a false God, a false deliverer, and the old traditions before the flood. All of these things are nothing new. From the Garden of Eden until the modern day in the Catholic Church, there is an unbroken chain of transmission, which is what I want you to learn today. But all these people concluded what they concluded, not based on science, but on spiritual leanings that they had. And they used math and science to basically justify their occult beliefs. This is why, yet again, heliocentrism can never be called a science. It can't. It's dressed up as science. It's dressed up in lots of math and conjectures and CGI, but it's not. It is a spiritual paradigm. Now let's look at the first globes, because these also started to pop up around the Counter-Reformation. This is this is Martin Beheim, who's also very important. He was born on my birthday. That's funny, 6 October 1459, and he lived until 1507. Martin von Beheim, and by various forms Martin of Bohemia, was a German textile merchant and cartographer. He served John II of Portugal and as advisor, who by the way was Catholic, and so you know where he's working for, as an advisor in matters of navigation, and participated in a voyage to West Africa. He is now best known for his Erdapfel, the world's oldest known globe, which he produced in the imperial city of Nuremberg in 1492. That's right, the first globe was also right around the time the cosmology was changing, which is very interesting. Let's see. Beheim globe. The Nuremberg globe of Berean. This is what it kind of looked like. So your modern globes are all based on these contraptions. After Beheim returned to Nuremberg in 1490, leading members of the city council financed the construction of a terrestrial globe. Under the direction of Beheim, a team of artisans and craftsmen constructed what has become the oldest extant globe. Georg Glockenden was the artist who created the actual map drawings following Beheim's specifications. The globe is about 21 inches in diameter and was fashioned from a type of paper mache and coated with gypsum. The ball was supported on a wooden tripod and secured by a pair of iron hoops. Glockenden's map drawings were painted onto parchment strips and pasted onto position around the sphere. The globe contains more than 2,000 place names, 100 pictorial illustrations, and more than 50 long legends. Many of the notations deal with fabulous monsters of foreign countries and their inhabitants, plants, and animals. Many notes also deal with trade, explorations, and famous travelers like Marco Polo. The world map depicted on the Beheim globe is based primarily on the geography of the 2nd century geographer Ptolemy. It also combines geographical information from other sources, including Marco Polo, John Mandeville, and Portuguese explorer Diogo Gomes. It is notable for lacking more current Portuguese geographic data, which had also been available to Beheim, and it contains numerous errors that did not reflect contemporary geographical understanding. But it was just in time for all the things to happen with Galileo and Copernicus and the Counter-Reformation, all the dialectics that were about to happen. Very interesting, don't you think? The completed globe, which came to be called Erdapfel or Earth Apple by the townspeople, was originally housed in Nuremberg City Hall. In the 17th century, the Beheim family took possession of the globe. It was inexpertly restored in 1823 and again in 1847, resulting in the corruption of many place names and labels. The German National Museum in Nuremberg later took possession of the globe, which is commonly known as the Nuremberg Terrestrial Globe. The antiquity of this globe and the year of its execution on the eve of discovery of the Americas makes it not just the oldest globe, but also represents an encyclopedia of Europe's knowledge of the known world in 1492. I'm sure they knew much more of what they tell you in the history books because there's a lot of conspiratorial things with, what's his name? Christopher Columbus too, but that's for another time. Here's Erdapfel. That's what it looks like. I think this is the real original. It's been, touched up a little bit, but they had a globe and they put these little things on there and they made all of these interesting things that people started talking about around that time. This is the ostrich globe, ostrich egg globe. Ostrich egg globe is a hollow terrestrial globe made from the conjoined lower halves of 2 ostrich eggs. The map carved on the globe is an extremely close, if not identical, match to the Hunt-Lennox globe, a copper globe reliably dated to about 1510. The owner of the ostrich egg globe, Stefan Michne, claims that it was made in the early 16th century and is therefore the first globe to ever depict the New World. So now they have another globe to depict the New World, and we're doing all this exploration, and the Earth must be a globe. I wonder if Columbus had to do something with the change in cosmology, in that there was all these discoveries, quote unquote discoveries, because I'm sure they knew about them already. That's why they sent Columbus out there. But Columbus set sail, and then they had started making these globes, and of course that prompted more cosmological change, and Copernicus and Galileo and yada yada yada. Very interesting things, how all these things are related. But that's the ostrich egg globe. First globe to tell you to reflect the New World. Here's the Hunt-Lennox globe. This is, the Hunt-Lennox or Lennox globe, dating from about 1508, is the second or third oldest known terrestrial globe after the Erdapfel and the ostrich egg. The Hunt-Lennox globe is housed by the rare book division of the New York Public Library. It is notable as one of only 2 known instances of a historical map actually using the phrase "Hic sunt dracones," in Latin, "Hic," which here are dragons. So this is another interesting point, though, because if you do look on ancient maps, there is documentation of dinosaurs, of dragons, basically, which is what they are. They're dragons. And there's documentation even in old Roman history. I believe they were trying to take some outposts in Africa and some dragon attacked them or something. So there's some crazy stuff to read about in history. And we'll look at some pictures too when we talk about the Smithsonian in the next episode. But what does it say? Since 2012, the owner investigator of the ostrich egg globe has claimed that in fact the Hunt-Lennox globe was not engraved at all, but was cast from the ostrich egg globe, using a very specific and unusual technique before the 2 halves of the egg globe were joined. So who knows? I'm sure that all these things have a similar author and a similar agenda, but I find it very interesting that the globes, the first globes, were right during the time when all of this stuff was starting to percolate and come to the forefront. This is Urbano Monti, which you need to know about. Urbano Monti was an Italian geographer and cartographer. And he was born in Milan, Italy, in a family of a minor nobility. He grew up together with his 2 younger brothers and his paternal cousins in the family house of Milan. Despite his noble status, Monti never held public office, but instead occupied himself with scholarship, particularly history and geography, with administering the family property and with philanthropic endeavors. Now, we know from today that whenever you see that word, it means something other than it actually means. Career. Monti's most famous work is a large-scale world map accompanied by a multi-volume treatise on geography and cosmology. The map reflects the geographical knowledge of his time, but in some ways it is surprisingly advanced. While drawing on the works of other early modern cartographers like Gerardus Mercator and Abraham Ortelius, he included some of the most recent discoveries of his time, including the archipelago of Tierra del Fuego. His depiction of Japan is particularly detailed and contains many place names not present on other Western maps of the time. Because they knew, of course they knew, Rome was the center of knowledge and of the occult and of Alexandra's information and everything else. And the interesting thing is, here's the map. Let's take a look at it. Look at this. Does this look familiar to you? This was made in the 1500s, folks. Here is your Gleason map that people believe. And with the Antarctica being the giant circle around the Earth, and you have the various South America, West, and so on. This is made in the 1500s. Now, the thing that's interesting to me is that this was also made around the time that those globes were being made. So the question is, did this idea of a 2 dialectical party system, basically you had like the flat Earth, quote unquote, and the globe Earth, and they all came out of the 1500s. Very interesting, because this is not true. The Earth is not a circle, and I'll prove that to you in the next episode. It's flat, for sure, but it's not a circle. And again, if that raises for you many questions, then keep your questions until the next time, because there's a lot of things to marvel at. But the Earth isn't a circle, and yet here we have the original Gleason map, basically, alongside the globes, being produced out of Rome, out of those territories by Catholics during and right before the Counter-Reformation. I should say, really, because the Counter-Reformation probably, I would say, began before the Jesuits, but the Jesuits were started in 1534, and that was because the church had begun having a problem with the Protestants before that, with Bibles being printed and so on. So things were starting to bubble up to the surface. And of course, by the early 1500s, the Jesuits began with Loyola and with people against like Luther and so on and so forth. So all these things started to come to the forefront. Why? Why is the question. That is the question of the day, which of course the answer is that all of these things were right around the time of the Counter-Reformation. There's a reason then that cosmology was changing at that time, because the Mother Church was losing control of everything and had to engage in information warfare and had to blast out various narratives that it would one day reconcile. All of them, somehow, all of these, the globes, the flat earth model, the circular model, they're all tied to the beast somehow, folks. Christopher Columbus was a Catholic. Cartographers of the maps and globes were Catholic. They were all Catholic operatives. Urbano Monti was a Catholic noble. So it's just very interesting that the modern map that the flat earthers use can be seen 500 years ago, right at the Counter-Reformation. Now, there's also a couple more here. This is Denis Diderot, who's also an important figure, born on 5th October, 1713. He was a French philosopher, art critic, and writer, best known for serving as a co-founder, chief editor, and contributor to the Encyclopédie, along with Jean Lerond Alembert. He was a prominent figure during the Age of Enlightenment. Diderot initially studied philosophy at a Jesuit college and then considered working in the church clergy before briefly studying law. When he decided to become a writer in 1734, his father disowned him. He lived a bohemian existence for the next decade. In the 1740s, he wrote many of his best-known works in both fiction and non-fiction, including the 1748 novel Les Bijoux Indiscrets, The Indiscreet Jewels. In 1751, Diderot co-created the Encyclopedia with Jean Lerond d'Alembert, whatever how that's pronounced. It was the first encyclopedia to include contributions from many named contributors and the first to describe the mechanical arts. Its secular tone, which included articles skeptical about biblical miracles, angered both religious and governmental authorities. In 1758, it was banned by the Catholic Church, and in 1759, the French government banned it as well, although this ban was not strictly enforced. Many of the initial contributors of the encyclopedia left the project as a result of the controversies, and some were even jailed. Are you starting to see the same kind of patterns? Hopefully. D'Alembert left in 1759, making Diderot the sole editor. Diderot also became the main contributor, writing around 7,000 articles. He continued working on the project till 1765. He was increasingly despondent about the Encyclopédie by the end of his involvement in it and felt that the entire project might have been a waste. Nevertheless, Encyclopédie is considered one of the forerunners of the French Revolution. So, was it a failure or was it a success? Of course it was a success, because by that point, the Jesuits were already shifting things and creating the atheistic mindset. Encyclopedia, was like the first encyclopedia. It was Catholic. And of course, it was also designed to control learning against learning and to drive people into a common mindset. Catholics created the university. Catholics created the encyclopedia. All of the sources of education started to basically coalesce under the Mother Church through centuries. We're talking centuries of time. But you need to know all these influential figures, because all the sources of information come back to the beast one way or another. Now, let's look at the Catholic Church in the last 500 years. What is this for? This is a flat earth. Something's a flat earth here. Oh, East Asia. Yes. The Catholic Church in the last, I forgot where I was for a second. I want to look at the Catholic Church in the last 500 years of the Counter-Reformation to show you that not only heliocentrism is Catholic, but how the devil wove this mystery religion belief into the Catholic Church and how involved the Catholic Church and controlling the Catholic Church has been over heliocentrism over the last 500 years, since it had to weaponize all of that occult knowledge that it had from previous cultures and empires. This, I was like, what am I looking at? This is a flat earth thing on Wikipedia, but if you scroll down, very interesting, in ancient China, the prevailing belief, this is East Asia, was that the earth was a flat square, while the heavens were round, and an assumption virtually unquestioned until the introduction of European astronomy in the 17th century. And we saw that, we documented it in the ancient Chinese, in the ancient cultures we looked at. China was one of them. The English sinologist Cullen emphasizes the point that there was no concept of a round earth in ancient Chinese astronomy. Quote, Chinese thought on the form of the earth remained almost unchanged from early times until the first contacts with modern science through the medium of the Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century. While the heavens were variously described as being like an umbrella covering the earth, or like the sphere surrounding it, or as being without substance while the heavenly bodies float freely, the earth was at all times flat, although perhaps bulging up slightly. So, who changed Chinese cosmology and when? The Jesuits. The Jesuit missionaries going out into East Asia and everywhere else in the world, by the way, not just China, were exporting the new cosmology of the beast to the world. And of course, they're converting people. And with the conversions come a conversion to Catholicism and the Catholic ideals of the new cosmology. And we know that the first Jesuit to write the French Revolution, to translate the art of war, was a Chinese missionary Jesuit. Was the name Jean-Marie Amiot, I think? Translated the art of war, supposedly, from Chinese into French 3 years before the French Revolution. So go figure. They were infiltrating these cultures all over the place. In fact, in Japan, I believe like 12 of them were killed. I forget when, but it was the same thing. They were trying to infiltrate the culture. Excuse me. And the emperor at the time just said, no more, that's it. Ban on the Jesuits. Oh, gotta drink a little water or something. But they killed all the Jesuits and they burned them at the stake, I think, or something, because they were seeing what was up. The Jesuits were infiltrating Japanese culture. And of course, they eventually won, but it tells you from historical evidence that the Jesuits were very busy infiltrating cultures. Now, let's look at this list of Catholic scientists, lay Catholic scientists. Here's a list, and let's just go through the list. Here's your Counter-Reformation, folks. All of these people are Catholics, famous Catholic scientists. And of course, out of these, if you do your research, over 50 of them are astronomers and physicists. So all of the people in the last 500 years, the majority of them in science that were astronomy, physics, and so on, they were Catholic. They were lay scientists. Here's a list of Catholic clergy scientists. Same thing. These are all Catholic clergy. Let's go through the list. Here it is. And you can just scroll through the list. All of these people were famous Catholic scientists. This is your Counter-Reformation at work. The beast knows that it needs to have a control of the narrative and a control of what people believe. And of course, that became much more important once the Reformation hit, because there were scientists, there were people living, in the 1300s that were doing science and so on. But remember, science and spirituality were never separate. This is the list. This is your counter. I'm not even all the way through the list. Look at all these people. This is the Counter-Reformation at work, folks. And when you realize the weight of what I'm showing you, then you realize the depth of this conspiracy. Okay, there is also this article from America Jesuit Review by William Critchley Minor, Society of Jesus. Why are there so many craters on the moon named after the Jesuits? Let's find out. 50 years ago this month, Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the moon. Centuries later, in 1651, the Jesuit astronomer Giovanni Riccoli was mapping and naming the craters on the moon that the astronauts would one day see in person. Of course, nobody's ever gone to the moon, but anyway, at the top of his map of the moon, Riccioli wrote, "Neither do men inhabit the moon, nor do souls migrate there." He was one in a long line of Jesuits who devoted their lives to questions not only about souls, but also about asteroids, meteorites, and stars. In his address to the Jesuits in their 35th General Congregation in 2008, Pope Benedict XVI said, quote, "The Church needs you, relies on you, to reach those physical and spiritual places which others do not reach or have difficulty in reaching." And Pope Benedict was the conservative one, which again, both sides of the beast, they all have the same goal, is to make you idolize and worship Satan through the man of sin rather than worshiping Christ. From the earliest days of the order, Jesuits have been reaching those physical and spiritual places, even in space. Throughout the history of the society, the Jesuits have been key players in astronomy, says Robert Mackey, Society of Jesus, a specialist in meteorites who works at the Vatican Observatory in Rome. Jesuit contributions to astronomy are significant enough that 34 craters on the moon and several asteroids are named after them. Did you know that? In fact, one of the moon's largest crater formations is named for Christopher Clavius, Society of Jesus. His astronomical and mathematical genius played a major role in the formation of the Gregorian calendar, the calendar system in almost universal use today. Why? Because the book of Daniel tells you that he'll think to change times and laws, and that's been fulfilled. During his lifetime, he was referred to as the Euclid of the 16th century, and he wrote textbooks that were read all over the world. Among those who learned from Clavius was Galileo, ding, 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 with whom he carried on a significant correspondence. See, the snake tells you. Galileo relied on other Jesuits as well. Pascal Scotti, in his 2017 book Galileo Revisited, writes that, quote, "Up until 1616, the Jesuits had been the greatest support to Galileo. And time and again, he turned to them as the beacons of scientific excellence and integrity in all his difficulties." Gotta love this stuff. But another Jesuit, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, ding, 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 if you know who that is, who was instrumental in falsifying the end times prophecies and creating dispensationalism, which I talk about quite a bit in my Great Delusion series. He played a key role in the beginnings of the Galileo affair. Bellarmine, on behalf of the Holy Office, was asked to inform Galileo that he had been accused of heresy. He encouraged Galileo either to present heliocentrism only as a hypothesis or to provide sufficient evidence to prove that the Earth rotated around the sun. Galileo, although he was right, did not have enough proof to satisfy the standards of the natural philosophy of the day. So a Jesuit, who was instrumental in the deception of the end times, was the one that was part of choreographing the Galileo debacle and the thing that we just described with him supposedly being accused by the Catholic Church and all of the drama, man. The Jesuits are the ones who are behind the drama, folks. You need to realize that. They're the masters of theater. More than a century later, it would be Roger Boscovich, a physicist. These are all Jesuits, by the way. Physicist and astronomer credited with developing a precursor to atomic theory, who would persuade the Vatican to remove the works of Copernicus, whose heliocentric theories Galileo championed, from a list of prohibited books. Now, do you remember that the Jesuits were basically allowed back in 1812? So 10 years later, a Jesuit is the one who's championing, let's read, it's time now. It's time to go from dark to light. It's time to switch this up. Let's deem the Copernican works as good. Let's accept them. And now we can demonize anybody who is going to be resisting this new cosmology because everybody else is believing it. So now it's time to flip. That's basically what this is telling you. The Jesuit tradition of astronomical discoveries continued with Angelo Secchi. He was the first to systematically classify stars using spectroscopy, breaking starlight into its component colors. His classification scheme was later borrowed and expanded by the Harvard Observatory to create the classification system that is still used today, Brother Mackey said. During his time as director of the Roman College, Secchi built an observatory on the roof of St. Ignatius Church in Rome. He studied sunspots and made important connections between solar activity and changes in the Earth's magnetic field. His book on the sun, quote, was one of the definitive works of his day, Brother Mackey said. Jesuit contributions to astronomy are not confined to the past. The work continues today at the Vatican Observatory, which is entrusted to the Jesuits. According to Brother Mackey, Richard D'Souza, Society of Jesus, and his collaborator from the University of Michigan, Eric Bell, recently discovered that the nearby Andromeda galaxy merged with another galaxy about 2 billion years ago. Well, there you go. Gosh, they're still at it, folks, is what he's telling you. Brother Mackey is inspired by his Jesuit astronomer colleagues who are studying in a variety of astronomical fields. Brother Guy Consolmagno, which was the one we documented in that heliosorcery documentary. Meteorites and asteroids, Father Richard Boyle, star clusters, Fathers David Brown and Chris Corbally, stellar evolution, Father Gabriel Gionti, quantum gravity and cosmology, and Father John Baptiste Kikoya Iluo, near-Earth asteroids and comets. Their work is no less remarkable than that of their Jesuit predecessors. Brother Mackey, along with Brother Consolmagno, Father Kikowaga Ulu, and Father Boyle, and Father George Coyne, former director of the Vatican Observatory, all have had asteroids named after them by the International Astronomical Union in recognition of their contributions to space exploration. So what does it tell you when the Jesuits have asteroids named after them? Of course, we don't even know what asteroids are, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. That the International Astronomical Union, which is supposed to be secular, is honoring the beast. Who owns the International Astronomical Union, which is supposed to be a secular scientific source of inquiry? Well, it tells you who owns them, just like you have the Vatican has a permanent observer at the UN. Same thing, folks. You gotta see behind all these little non-governmental organizations, and these things are just fronts to make the beast look good. You live in a giant echo chamber owned by the devil. And when you come to terms with that, you'll stop believing the nonsense of heliocentrism. The Jesuits at the Vatican Observatory find themselves serving in mission territory. Quote, like Jesuits before us, we do science together, we pray together, there is no problem. That's right, because the mystery religion and science is one thing. Of course, science today, not science as it should be. Paul Mueller, S.J., a historian and philosopher of science. He thinks that in the modern world, many people perceive science as more of an obstacle than help to faith. Our mission is to show by what we do and how we live that the church loves and appreciates science. Of course it does. It loves this kind of science because it leads you all back to the Mother Church, if you believe heliocentrism. I serve as a sign that scientific pursuits and religious life go hand in hand, agreed Brother Mackey. There is no conflict. My presence as a Jesuit scientist in public and at scientific meetings gives others the opportunity to engage me on questions of faith and science and to challenge their assumptions about the relationship between the two. These Jesuits are continuing a tradition that is not only astronomical but mystical. St. Ignatius, who was also an asteroid named in his honor, wrote in his autobiography that gazing at the stars gave him the greatest consolation. Diego Lainez, one of the first Jesuits, wrote that at night, St. Ignatius would go up to the roof of the house with the sky there above him. He would sit there quietly, absolutely quietly. He would take off his hat and look up for a long time at the sky. Then he would fall on his knees, bowing profoundly to God, and the tears would begin to flow down his cheeks like a stream. Now, if you believe that, I have a beautiful beachfront property house to sell you in Phoenix, because Ignatius of Loyola committed himself to Mary, and he had a vision of a shining serpent in a cave. So the God spoken of here, if this is a true story, is not the God of the Bible. It's not Jesus Christ. Ignatius could have imagined an observatory being built on the roof of a church that bore his name, and any more than Giovanni Riccoli could have fathomed a man walking on the moon he mapped. But 50 years after the giant leap from humankind, Jesuits continued to peer through telescopes and wonder, finding God in all places. There you go, folks. Jesuit cosmology, Jesuit math, Jesuit heliocentrism. Of course, we also know, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the author of The Big Bang was a Jesuit, Georges de Lemaitre. I'm pronouncing that right, but he was total Jesuit, and him and Einstein rubbed elbows a little bit. We also know that the Jesuits changed the Bible with Isaiah 42. We talked about this in some other places, but might as well show you again. This is Isaiah 42. This is in the ESV. It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. So it's he who sits above the circle of the earth. Okay. Well, if you go to Douay-Rheims, which is the Jesuit Bible, What does it say? It is he that sitteth upon the globe of the earth. Well, that's not a right translation because the word there is circle. It's a circle of the earth, just like how God drew a circle on the face of the deep. It's a circular shape. I'm not saying the earth, the land is a circle, but the realm seems to be a circle. Of course, we also know the Jesuit Bible has this in Genesis 3, verse 15. I will put enmities between thee and the woman, and thy seed and her seed. Okay, so far so good. She shall crush thy head, and thou shalt light in a wait for her heel. Do you notice a serious problem with this translation? Well, it's shifted the attention from the gospel of Jesus Christ to Mary. Mary's the Redemptor. She is the one that's going to crush the serpent's head. Dark to light. And she is the one who the serpent is waiting in for her heel. Like what? Mary didn't get crucified. So this is a blatant change. Blatantly Antichrist. Dewey Remus Bible. So can you trust what the snake has to say? No, absolutely not. And that's the point of today, folks. And there's more. There's more to go over. This is from Catholic.com. But it's important to document. Relax. The Vatican didn't name a telescope Lucifer. Relax. We didn't do that. Question. Why is the Vatican named its telescope in Arizona Lucifer? I'm a proud and devoted Catholic, and I find this quite disturbing. Good job, sir or ma'am. Hopefully the Holy Spirit will continue to guide you and help you get out of mystery religion Babylon. Answer. Let's see what the snake has to say. The Vatican did not name a telescope Lucifer. The Vatican Observatory shares space with other organizations and groups. The Vatican Observatory does not own each piece of equipment, nor can it give official names or nicknames to things it does not own. Now, really quick pause. Do you remember International Astronomical Society, whatever, honoring the Jesuits? Who owns that society? Who does the bidding of the beast? Do you think that this is true? That just because on paper they don't own it, that they don't actually own it? Come on now. Another group installed a telescope it nicknamed Lucifer. It's a telescope built by the Max Planck Institute for Extraterrestrial Physics, and according to the Planck Institute website, it stands for LBT Near Infrared Spectroscopic Utility with Camera and Integral Field Unit for Extragalactic Research. It is noted on the website that its official abbreviation has been changed to Lucy. Now, they could have picked so many ways to name this telescope, but it picked something to honor their god, which of course is the devil. And the devil's name is not Lucifer. We talked about that in my Satan series, but either way, to them, he's the light bringer. This is also an interesting article regarding the Vatican's Lucifer telescope. Mount Graham. Apaches say a sacred place was first stolen, then defiled. From AZ Central, down where I live here. One of Arizona's Sky Islands, a sacred place to the Apaches, has been damaged by development and a controversial observatory. Dzil Nikcha Si'an, or Big Seated Mountain in Apache, is shown on most maps as Mount Graham. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit, just a teensy. That is a huge amount, but okay. It is Mount Graham. At 10,700 feet above sea level, it dominates the otherwise flat landscape in southern Arizona's Gila River Valley. As one of the Southwest's Sky Islands, it holds biological riches. The climate ranges from desert at the lowest elevation to subalpine at the highest, where green woods offer cool relief from the searing deserts below, and precious springs trickle down the slopes to feed rivers like the Gila. Native species like the Mount Graham red squirrel cling to survival in the forests. But to the Western Apaches, Mount Graham is more than a nice place to play during scorching summer months or a source of biological diversity. It's a holy ground, sacred and alive to the Apache, the bands that call this corner of the Southwest home. Quote, Mount Graham is considered one of our holy places, one of the sacred mountains to east and to the south, one of the most sacred mountains, said Ramon Riley, a White Mountain Apache member who heads the tribe's cultural resource department. It's the home of the Ga'an, or Apache mountain spirits, and the source of life-giving water for at least 7 streams in the area. Since time immemorial, Apache people and Puebloan people have respected that mountain, Riley said. It's where we go to gather our medicinal plants to do our prayers. That's where we find peace and comfort to pray in our quiet way. So this mountain that the Vatican, you will see, lobbied extensively and won, Congress approved it, tells you who owns Congress, for them to establish this observatory on a pagan high place. And of course, you know that they love their high places. There's more here I'm not going to read, but there is a couple things here that we need to read. Apaches and other native peoples must now obtain a permit to conduct ceremonies in the forest, according to a forest spokesperson. This requirement rankles many, including former San Carlos Apache chairman and native rights advocate Wensler Nosey. Here he is. He was arrested in 1997 for trespassing when he was fleeing an oncoming thunderstorm using the construction road built for what the Apaches considered sacrilege, a telescope complex on the mountain's peak. In the early 1980s, the University of Arizona and the Vatican selected Mount Graham as the preferred site for a huge observatory with up to 20 telescopes. What is the Vatican doing in America, partnering with one of the universities into doing this affair? It tells you who's running the show, folks. That's what it tells you. 1986 draft environmental impact statement developed by the Forest Service said archaeological sites were detected within the observatory area, and that, quote, the most appropriate treatment of these sites must be determined in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Officer and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The Forest Service also said, presently no known impact on Native American religious use exists. The telescope project would also play havoc with the red squirrel's primary habitat, which brought environmentalists together with tribal leaders in opposition. News accounts at the time reported that the Apache tribal leaders said they were given insufficient notification of the project. As they learned that what was at stake, the San Carlos Apache tribe issued several resolutions against the observatory. Nevertheless, Congress approved the construction plan, as if they had any other choice. After the Arizona Board of Regents followed suit, the details of what the telescopes would cost, the environment, and the Apache people emerged. The observatory ended up in court, and the opponents lost yet again. So, these people who basically believed this mountain is a home to spirits, mountain spirits, it was a way to commune with the spirit world, it was a way to do your prayers, it was a high place, a pagan high place. What happened? Well, it got subsumed by the Catholic Church. And they put an observatory there, and they're telling you they're doing all this astronomical work when in fact it's owned by the Jesuits, and the Jesuits administer it, and they're doing all these things with other organizations, front organizations like the Max Planck Institute, which is supposed to be a, secular type of situation. But of course we know who owns these things, folks. The beast owns these things, and the beast has created many, many threads to link back to itself, to create the echo chamber so the world can marvel after the beast. This is the Hall of Saints, and this is a room in the Borgia apartment of the Vatican Palace, frescoed by the Italian Renaissance artist Pinturicchio. It dates to 1491 and 1484 and was commissioned by Pope Alexander VI. Remember this Pope, because we're going to watch a little bit about him. The frescoes depict scenes from the lives of the saints. The ceiling fresco, which depicts myths related to the ancient Egyptian gods Osiris and Isis, has been the subject of much scholarly attention. The iconographic program reflects the humanistic interests of Alexander and was likely designated by his secretary Giovanni Agno, designed by his secretary Giovanni Agno of Viterbo. It shows his interests. Such a watered-down explanation about something so occult, with an arch, with a bull, with Hermes Trismegistus, with all these gods and goddesses, and Osiris and Isis and so on. This is painted in the papal apartment of a pope who is very, very well known for many evil things, nonetheless, which tells you everything. It tells you that the mystery religion of the ages from Egypt and from even before that carried its way all the way through all the places that I mentioned into Rome. And because that confirms the Bible tells you that out of all the places, the dragon gave the beast his throne, his power, and great authority. All of that secret knowledge and evil deception came into Rome. But who is Pope Alexander VI? Well, let's learn a little bit about Pope Alexander VI. This is a video, I'm probably not going to watch all of it, but you can learn just a little bit. Probably, maybe the first couple minutes or something. Let's see.
Black sheep of the papacy, a pope whose lust for wealth and power knew no bounds. The great Italian writer Niccolò Machiavelli who wrote the world's most renowned book on unscrupulous politicians, once said of this pope, he never did anything or thought of anything other than deceiving men. We might add women to that too, because this incorrigible and corrupt pope fathered quite a few illegitimate children. He was also renowned as being something of a smooth talker and not hard on the eyes to females. Some say he sold his soul to the devil and would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Welcome to the life of the bad pope, Alexander VI. He was born on the first day of the new year in
So his very corrupt pope, I just wanted to show you this little introduction. This is a 10-minute video. You can check it out yourself, and you can look into it yourself. But Pope Alexander VI, extremely corrupt, part of one of the papal families, the Borgia family. And of course, his progeny was also very corrupt. This is the banquet of chestnuts, sometimes called the Ballet of Chestnuts, the Festival of Chestnuts, or the Joust of Whores. Was a supper purportedly held at the papal palace in Rome and hosted by the former Cardinal Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, on the 31st of October, 1501. Kind of like the same day they have Halloween and all the satanic activities they have, the passing of the realms from one into another. Both contemporary and modern authors have questioned the accuracy of Burchard's accounts. Two independent contemporary sources confirm that a social event occurred on the date given by Burchard, but given fewer details of the festivities. Vatican researcher Peter... So what happened with this banquet of chestnuts? Well, I've documented this before, a very filthy banquet where basically it's an orgy and making people do all sorts of things, kind of like the Diddy, kind of stuff that's surfacing today, nothing new under the sun. And now I'm reading you some apology about it. Vatican researcher Peter de Roo, in his 5-volume History of Alexander VI, speculates that the passage may be a later interpolation in Burchard's memoirs, arguing that the Pope could not be capable of such truly bestial behavior. Other historians, however, have criticized de Roo's biography, describing it as a, quote, a vast apologetic work in which much useful material is often almost undetectable under the coat of whitewash, and as uncritically accepting of all praise and rejecting all criticism of Alexander VI. Alexander VI was very corrupt. All the popes are corrupt as far as I'm concerned, but he especially stands out in history. And what connection do you see? Well, you see that his progeny is extremely corrupt. You see that his papal apartment had mystery religion stuff in it in secret, where on the public he's supposed to be ministering to people the gospel. And so you have this duality that the Bible warns about consistently over and over. So the conclusion of all of this is what, my friends? The Bible tells you that Satan gave his power and throne and great authority to the Catholic Church. That means that in the church age, Satan will use this system to actualize the religio-political system that he had before the flood, that he tried to have throughout all these systems, through Babel, through Babylon, through the various world empires. He's going to be allowed to actualize the system. And the way that's going to look is through the Catholic ideal and the Catholic system. History, of course, testifies against the Catholic Church, especially in its involvement in the heliocentric conspiracy. All of the occult influences, the corruption, the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits, everything to subvert reality and ultimately bring people back to the beast. Reformers initially did not believe in a ball, but they believed in biblical cosmology. They knew that the Catholic Church was up to something. But eventually they were seduced through generations and through all these dialectics and through all these schemes and false signs and wonders and, science and this and that. And they came to be seduced instead of standing for the truth. And that's why I said if you want to be a quote-unquote Protestant, if there is such a thing today, you have to protest everything of the Catholic Church. Otherwise, you can't possibly call yourself a Protestant. If you're going and resting on Sunday, if you believe the earth is a ball, if you believe in Armenian salvation, all of this is Catholic stuff, folks. The Catholic Church has waged war on the truth through countless tentacles. One of them happens to be cosmology, because as you'll see, cosmology is designed to make people believe that uniting in a new world order is a good idea. And you'll see how it all comes together pretty profoundly. But cosmology was one of the lies. That's why you have to understand your cosmology. If you believe heliocentrism, you believe Rome's version of cosmology. It's a spiritual belief, not a scientific one. And hopefully that's clear to you by now. But here's some questions to ask yourself. If the Jesuits are behind so many conspiracies, and they're all over this heliocentric stuff, what does that tell you? If you didn't know anything about heliocentrism and you were totally into that, and that's okay, But you knew about the Jesuits. And I know people in this boat. I know people who exposed the Jesuits, and yet they still stubbornly hold on to heliocentrism. When they see all of the stuff the Jesuits have done, and they're continually doing in the heliocentric world to convince the world of all of these signs and wonders. And yet you still believe heliocentric science, which is nonsense. Another question to ask yourself is, why did Pope Alexander VI have a pagan, hermetic mural honoring Egyptian mystery religions in his private apartment? Why are most figures in astronomy and cosmology in the last 500 years Catholic? Either lay person or clergy, Jesuits. Why did the Vatican fight for an observatory on pagan holy ground and basically manipulate Congress to lobby for them and win? Why were they so insistent? They could have gone anywhere. Why are they so insistent on this particular pagan site that is so holy to the pagans? Of course, if you know your history, then you know why. Why did Congress permit the Vatican to have these allowances and to make these advances on American territory when the founding fathers had nothing to do with Rome? They wanted everything to be separate from Rome, and they knew about the dangers of the Jesuits. And yet here we are, a couple hundred years later, and the Vatican is dictating how things go and taking claim of things in the United States. That's a national security issue. But of course, if you understand that the Jesuits took over the United States after the Civil War, basically, with the 14th Amendment, with the Act of 1872, the federal government, everything, and the Rothschilds and central banking, and then pretty soon after that, the Federal Reserve Act, all this stuff successively weaponized the United States for the Vatican. Of course, Vatican didn't really officially become the Vatican in 1929, so let's just say Rome. But either way, the United States is doing the bidding of Rome. So that's what changed. Those who know their history are wise to these things. Those who do not know their history are bound to get swallowed when it repeats. Now, I want to cover a little bit more, because we still have some more things to cover with the 1500s to 1700s. And a big part of this is also Henry Cavendish. Cavendish is a famous figure in heliocentrism, and he also was during the Counter-Reformation and the Enlightenment, so he's very important. And of course, he's a favorite example among globe believers that Cavendish proved gravity, discovered gravity through his supposed experiment, which of course is not true. I talk about this in my 20 Reasons Gravity is a Fraud video, but we will be documenting it here. So I'm going to take a quick break. We'll be right back, a couple seconds, and we'll be right into it. Okay, well, we're back. We're now focusing on Cavendish, and this is Wikipedia, Cavendish experiment. You can look this up for yourself and basically get the idea. We'll look at a video as well of what he did. But Cavendish experiment was performed in 1797, 1798. Nice little date there for you. By English scientist Henry Cavendish, was the first experiment to measure the force of gravity between masses in the laboratory, and the first to yield accurate values for the gravitational constant. How do you know? That's the question. Because of the unit conventions then in use, the gravitational constant does not appear explicitly in Cavendish's work. Instead, the result was originally expressed as the relative density of the Earth, or equivalently the mass of the Earth. That's an important point. He discerned the mass of the Earth based on an assumption that he made. Because remember, if you've watched my 20 Reasons Why Gravity is a Fraud video, the logic and math of gravity is circular. In order to determine gravity, you have to know the mass of an object. In order to know the mass of an object, you have to solve for gravity. So it's circular reasoning. And this is exactly what it is. He measured something. We'll talk about that. He assumed it was a force, and then he used that to determine the mass of the Earth, supposedly. Of course, it's all just conjecture. His experiment gave the first accurate values of these geophysical constants. We'll learn a lot about the so-called constant of gravity today. The experiment. The apparatus consisted of a torsion balance made of a 6-foot wooden rod horizontally suspended from a wire. Don't worry if this is going to go over your head. We're going to watch an animation of it, but here's a graphic of it as well. With 2-inch diameter and 1.6 pound one lead spheres, one each attached to the end. Two massive 12-inch, 348 pound lead balls suspended separately could be positioned away from or to either side of the smaller balls, 8.8 inches away. The experiment measured the faint gravitational attraction between the small and large balls, which deflected the torsion balance rod by about 0.16 of an inch or only about 0.03 of an inch with a stiffer suspending wire. There is small attraction between masses. I shouldn't say mass because I don't believe in mass, but between matter, there is small attraction, but it's not gravity, folks. There's something else going on. The two larger balls could be positioned either way from or to either side of the torsion balance rod. Their mutual attraction to the small balls caused the arm to rotate, twisting the suspension wire. The arm rotated until it reached an angle where the twisting force of the wire balanced the combined gravitational force of attraction between the large and small lead spheres. By measuring the angle of the rod and knowing the twisting force or the torque of the wire for a given angle, Cavendish was able to determine the force between the pairs of the masses. Since the gravitational force of the Earth on the small ball could be measured directly by weighing it, another assumption that weight is the product of matter, of gravitation acting on matter, which is not true. Weight is just a natural property of the universe. You don't need a magical force to determine weight. But again, this is all just mathematical conjectures. You're making up numbers out of thin air. The ratio of the two forces allowed the relative density of the Earth to be calculated using Newton's law of gravitation. And so the rest of history is just another one of these people that was propped up to basically tell you that, oh, this has been so scientific and gravity's been around forever. But no, it's not. This is fake news. This is an animation of it. You got the large balls, and you can position them really close, and then you can measure. You see, okay, there's an attraction of some kind. That seems to happen. So, problems with Cavendish's experiment. Now, of course, I talk about this in the 20 Reasons Why Gravity is a Fraud, but number one problem is that it was never repeated vertically. So how does that figure? Well, if you have, let's say that we take the hypothesis and say, yes, matter exerts some sort of force. And the more dense a matter is, the more matter there is, the more force it's exerting. Okay, right, let's test it vertically too. Because if supposedly the Earth is pulling on you with a force constantly, which it's not, but let's say it is, then if you had, let's say, a wrecking ball, okay, a giant piece of steel or metal or whatever it's made out of, a wrecking ball, I don't know how much those weigh, but they weigh a lot. And then you had, let's say, an orange, right? Two objects. Take a penny. Very simple experiment, folks. You can even try this at home. And put a penny on each one. Put a penny on the right on the bottom of the wrecking ball. Put a penny on the bottom of the orange. Suspend them at the same height. Let the penny go at the same time. And what should we see? Well, if there is a force that is pulling on things, then what you should see is that the penny that drops from the wrecking ball would drop a little bit later, because the force pulling from the wrecking ball would interact with the force of the Earth. Of course, the force of the Earth would win because it's a net positive, but it would be much... The orange doesn't have much mass in it, supposedly, right? It doesn't have much matter. So it wouldn't have much of a force to pull the penny. So there should be a difference between these two things. Do a larger thing. Take some giant object, suspend it over the ground, and take a penny on both sides and see, does it affect? And of course, nobody's ever done this experiment because it would completely disprove Cavendish immediately, because there is no such effect. There's no such gravity. There's no such force. There does seem to be minor attraction between matter, but we will talk about that in just a little bit. It's not gravity. We live in an electromagnetic world that is very interesting. And of course, what you've been told about that world is designed to put forward a particular model of the universe. And of course, that model is designed to serve the beast in the end. But it's never been repeated vertically. It's never been repeated multiple times with multiple materials, multiple sizes, multiple conditions. It was just this one thing that was done. Oh my gosh, and everybody's just propping up Cavendish, this amazing genius. It's just typical stuff that's coming out of the Counter-Reformation. How do you control for every possible variable that would account for these tiny little attraction between two masses? Matters, really. Mass, you have to get rid of that word from your vocabulary because mass doesn't exist. Mass to them, is the product of gravity acting on matter. Gravity doesn't exist, therefore mass doesn't exist. Mass is a conjecture to insert gravity into the picture as a force. Unless you're Einstein, which, the gravity is bending of space, and that's, you have to decide which version of gravity you believe in, but they're both fake. Today, physicists say that 95% of the universe is dark matter or dark energy, i.e., we don't know. If I don't really believe that, but let's say you take them on their own word for it. They're shooting themselves in the foot with this quantum, dark matter, all this kind of stuff. Because if the universe is mostly dark matter, things that you do not understand how they work, go back now to people like Cavendish and say, well, is it possible that maybe there was some other explanation for what you observed? Isn't that the scientific thing to do? To look at an experiment and say, is there possibly another alternative explanation? Or is there something that can falsify this? With Eratosthenes, he didn't know about refraction. Now that we know about refraction, isn't it normal, logical, scientific inquiry to go back to that experiment and see if you can falsify it with new knowledge? And of course you can. It's been done experimentally. If you take a table and you took a refractive lens and you put a local light source, like they did on Decimal Z's channel, they reproduced the experiment multiple times with multiple points. And they showed you that you can take math and take a ball or take a table and turn it into a ball with math. And nobody's the wiser because the math works out. Why? Why? Because math is about relationships, folks. If the lens is curved and the earth is straight, then you can take math and flip that relationship and make the earth curved and the light straight. And nobody's the wiser because the math works out. It's about relationships, curved to straight. If you're trying to make both curves, it's not going to work, but the math will work out either way. Remember how that 11th century Muslim, mathematician, heliocentrist, although he rejected heliocentrism, but either way, he said, either way is fine. The math can represent it either way, and you'll see plenty more people saying the same thing. So math is not what it seems. Remember also that there's circular reasoning. Mass equals the force of gravity acting on matter, F equals ma type of thing. And gravity equals the amount of mass that something has, meaning gravity is based on how much matter or mass something has. The more mass, the more gravity. But how do you find out mass? Well, mass is the product of gravity acting on matter. Well, how do you find out gravity? Well, gravity is the product of gravity is dependent upon how much mass there is. Do you see the circular reasoning? It's circular because, of course, it has to be circular. Otherwise, there's no deception. Cavendish assumed the weight of the balls is a product of gravity. What if it's not? What if weight is a natural property of matter and you don't need a magical force like gravity to be acting on matter to produce mass? Does that make sense? He assumed that when he weighed the ball, this is gravity, so we know that there's a certain gravitational constant there, and we're just going to take that number and plug it in there and do this and do that, and you just make this whole fairy tale in your mind that has nothing to do with anything. A lot of assumptions, a lot of poor science, and of course it's lauded to you as, it's just amazing science, which of course tells you that this is a conspiracy. Cavendish derived the mass of the Earth based on conjecture. He never calculated the mass of the Earth. He never calculated gravity. He never measured anything. He measured probably some very minor electromagnetic phenomenon. And you'll see some examples of that. But the question is, how do we know there isn't something else going on? Well, good question. Let's look at some articles. You have one remaining free article. That's okay. Wayback Machine can solve that problem. Researchers discover a new kind of magnetism. This is from February 2024. More than 200 materials could be ultramagnets, predicted just a few years ago. Let's see. For thousands of years, people have been drawn to the apparent magic of magnets. Ancient Greek philosophers believed dark rocks called lodestones had souls because of their ability to move iron flakes. Physicists now know that magnetic materials glean their power from the behavior of the atoms inside them. But magnetism still holds secrets. Researchers have recently found signs of a wholly new class of magnetism. One with characteristics of each of the two conventional kinds, ferromagnetism and anti-ferromagnetism. More than 200 materials should exhibit the newfound phenomenon according to the theoretical predictions. And physicists are closing in on direct experimental evidence for it. which could lead to more efficient electronic devices. Already they have found a handful of materials that seem to exhibit this fundamentally new type of magnetism. It's not new, it's been there forever. God created it from the very beginning, but we're discovering it. Says Paul McClarty, a physicist at Leon Brillouin Laboratory. It's expanding our understanding of the ways that matter can work. Yes, it is. So now the question is, if you're discovering these things, is anybody willing to go back to Cavendish and say, is there something else going on here? Because if you're an honest scientist, that's what you would do. When you have such a weak force, and supposedly it's so, powerful, and it's able to bend oceans, but you're measuring it so teeny tiny, that doesn't make any sense, first off. And second off, how are you sure that you haven't ruled out other things? The question is, you're not. And this is proof of it, because people are discovering more and more things that we didn't know with magnetism and the forces of the world that are true, like magnetism. This is from Physics World, also from March 2024. Scientists discover that like-charged particles can sometimes attract. From a young age, we are taught in school that like charges, whether both positive or both negative, will repel each other, while opposing charges attract. It turns out that under certain conditions, like charges can actually attract each other instead. In a work recently published in Nature of Nanotechnology, researchers at the University of Oxford have demonstrated the attraction of like-charged particles in solutions. Do we understand electromagnetism? No, we don't. We understand some things. Sure, we can predict certain things, but we're finding out more and more that life is such a profound mystery, this mechanism of the universe, of nature, of the laws of physics. They don't know left from right, man. They posture like they do. And science has become this idol that you have to worship as the objective source of truth and knowledge. When in fact, this is just occult mystery religion stuff, repackaged with math, and all of the advances that we're finding are being redirected into that system. Nobody will ever take these findings and go back to Cavendish and say, maybe we need to reevaluate the whole thing that we settled on with Cavendish. Because they won't, because science is owned by the beast. But anyway, the journey began for the lead scientist Madhavi Krishnan back in the mid-2000s when she came across the like-charge attraction problem while studying how DNA molecules squeezed into slit-like boxes. It was expected that DNA would flatten into a pancake-like geometry, but instead it aligned alongside the edge of the box. Without any external forces being applied, the only explanation was that DNA was attracted to the box, despite them being negatively charged, both being negatively charged. Thus, an interest in how attraction and repulsion may not be as they seem was born. The like-charge problem is not new knowledge, though. Different scientists over the years have tried to explain how these like charges can attract, with some of the earliest works coming from Irving Langmuir back in the 1930s. One of the areas where like-charge attraction is seen the most is within fluids, and the interaction of solid matter with fluids. I encountered the problem early in my trajectory as a scientist, Krishnan tells Physics World. Considering the observations entailed such a fundamental departure from the current understanding of a basic and central phenomenon in the fluid phase, turning away the problem was never going to be an option. The attraction of like charges in fluids has been seen many times using multivalent ions, but these are known ionic species that are exempt from DLVO theory. The expectation that like-charged molecules will repel at long ranges when van der Waals forces are too weak to influence the interactions between molecules. In other words, they don't know left from right, man. However, a number of molecules that are expected to follow the rules of DLVO theory, such as nucleic acids, liposomes, polymers, and colloidal particles in aqueous media, have been shown to possess some level of attraction when like charges are present. Why is this so important? What is the point behind these articles? The point behind these articles is that as of this year, 2024, we don't know anything about the universe, folks. We don't know anything about how electromagnetism truly works. They're finding materials that they thought weren't magnetic, and now they have the same properties of ferromagnetism and antiferromagnetism. They're finding like charges and negative charges. So whether they're like or positive or negative doesn't matter, as long as they're like, meaning the same, that it's possible for these things to attract, which breaks the entire programming of attraction is only between positive and negative. So we have models that can predict things for sure, and science has evolved, but also science can't be divorced from the corruption. of the agenda and the beast and everything else. But there is science, of course. Not all science is corrupted. There's legitimate science, and science is discovering every day more and more things that question everything. You'll see some examples of gravity too when we talk about that in just a second. But the point is that every day we're learning more and more. And their explanations on gravity are all over the place. You'll see from these articles I've pulled up, they have no clue what it is. And it's not a constant. Their measurements are constantly off. They have no idea what they're measuring. And what the point is that Cavendish, having all of this now revealed, that there's all these ways that magnetism works that we don't really understand. Given the fact that Cavendish was never repeated multiple times with multiple materials, given the fact that Cavendish wasn't repeated under different circumstances or vertically or whatever else, and yet it's taken as this absolute proof of gravity. It's such bad science. But of course that it makes sense if it's a conspiracy, because conspiracies hide the truth. And the more you dig, the more you realize that there is no truth there whatsoever. Their model is always being debunked by things that they discover. You'll see in a future section of this when we look at some articles like we talked about in the Eratosthenes episode, where basically in 2017, they had that eclipse that totally broke their prediction. And so they had to change the size of the sun and the distance and all this stuff, and they panicked. And it just got swept under the rug. Nobody really talked about it. But that's significant. If the sun is bigger or farther away, your entire model collapses. Do you understand? Because then the orbit of the Earth has to be larger around the sun. Then the years are longer. Then the seasons are longer. Everything doesn't match reality suddenly if you change your figures. So they panicked, and of course you can still find the article, but we'll look at that. We'll look at that for sure. And the point is that all these things are, if you're a student of science, you see this and you say, wow, that really calls into question the Cavendish experiment at the very minimum. But if you're indoctrinated, you'll say, oh no, gravity's been proven since the 1600s. Come on, folks. Questions you need to ask yourself when you're dealing with the Cavendish situation with people. Anyone who brings this up, ask them some of these questions. Why hasn't it been repeated vertically? To prove that if a giant piece of mass is attracting something, then it would affect the fall of a small thing like a penny to the ground. Why hasn't it been repeated? If gravity is working from the center of an object outward, then we should be able to reproduce this on a vertical scale as well. But you won't. You won't be able to do that because gravity doesn't exist. How do we know that we can't rule out an existing phenomenon like magnetism, where especially recently science is coming to terms with things that completely flip what we know about magnetism upside down? Why don't you see things orbiting mountains where you have giant clusters of matter, like a mountain? Supposedly that's supposed to have more gravity around it, right? Than the floor that's just empty. So why don't we see, like if you go to the top of a mountain, why don't you see rocks like levitating around the mountain or orbiting it in some way? Why doesn't gravity act that way? Well, because of the gravity of the Earth. Well, if the gravity of the Earth is that strong and it's preventing the manifestation of gravity around mountains to manifest a certain way, how then are you so sure that Cavendish measured anything? Does that make sense? Like if gravity is that powerful and it won't allow anything to manifest on a mountain, like a rock levitating or floating around a mountain or whatever, then it would overpower anything happening on a tiny little difference between a ball and another ball. And oh, look, it moved. It just sounds so suspect to me. It's so suspect. But of course, people never question what they were brought up with. And they don't question, like if you go to a mountain, you don't feel any different because the gravity is different there. I mean, it's just nonsense. Gravity is a farce, folks. Watch my 20 Reasons. Understand why gravity is part of the head of the snake. There are many mysteries we're going to be revealing in the next episode about the true cosmology we live in, which is a mystery. But the point is that you don't get lost in things like arguing about plane flights and, the position of the sun, what's it doing? All these things are dead ends. If you want to win the fight in cosmology with anybody, you have to focus on 4 things: gravity, the horizon, water, and the gospel. I have 2 short videos that are animated that can arm you about gravity and the gospel, why heliocentrism is not compatible with Christianity from a theological perspective. We have one on gravity, the 20 Reasons. And the first episode of this series talks about the horizon. We look at plenty of proofs there, impossible measurements, especially now with technology. Observations of like 600 miles, which is impossible on a ball, and so on and so forth. And of course, water. Water does not curve. Water stays level. It always stays level. It's always been level, which tells you that you're not on a ball. So those four things are globe killers. And of course, if you don't have gravity, then the entire model falls apart. That's why gravity is so propped up. That's why somebody like Cavendish, who is probably not much of a scientist, he's one of these wealthy people that had nothing else to do, probably a secret society member, who basically did some poor experiment, because just like Eratosthenes, he didn't have the luxury of technology. And he's propped up as this god in science that you need to listen to, that he absolute proof and testimony and this and that you need to believe. And it just reeks of a conspiracy. So obvious when you see it. It really does. Now, I want to highlight some problems with gravity, because there are many problems with gravity, and we will be looking at them. This is from September 18th, 2013. Puzzling measurement of big G gravitational constant ignites debate. Gravity, one of the constants of life, not to mention physics, is less than constant when it comes to being measured. Various experiments over the years have come up with perplexingly different values for the strength of the force of gravity. With the latest calculation just adds to the confusion. The results of a painstaking 10-year experiment to calculate the value of big G, the universal gravitational constant, were published this month. And they're incompatible with the official value of gravity, which itself comes from a weighted average of various other measurements that are mostly mutual, incompatible, and diverge by more than 10 times their estimated uncertainties. In fact, the discrepancy is such a problem that Quinn is organizing a meeting in February at the Royal Society in London to come up with a game plan for resolving the impasse, i.e. propaganda, how we're going to flip this so that we don't look stupid. The meeting's titled The Newtonian Constant of Gravitation, a Constant Too Difficult to Measure, reveals the general consternation. So now they're probably going to switch to quantum gravity, or, it's oscillating. Most scientists think all the discrepancies reflect human sources of error, rather than the true inconsistency of big G. We know the strength of gravity hasn't been fluctuating over the past 200 years, for example, because if so, the orbits of the planets around the sun would have changed, Quinn says. How do you know that the orbits of these luminaries in the sky, and they're doing their various circuits, how do you know that they're orbiting around the sun? How do you know that they're being held up in a void by gravity? That's the question. That's the major assumption that people make. Still, it's possible that the incompatible measurements are pointed to in unknown subtleties of gravity. Perhaps its strength varies depending on how it's measured or where on Earth the measurements are being made, i.e. relativism. When in doubt, hide behind relativism. This is going to be a consistent theme as we enter the 19th and 20th centuries. You'll see what I'm talking about in those coming sections. Either something is wrong with the experiments or there is a flaw in our understanding of gravity, says Mark Kasevich, a Stanford University physicist who conducted an unrelated measurements of big G in 2007 using an atom interferometer. Further work is required to classify the situation. So they don't know left from right for these things. Let's see. We'll have a couple more to read on here. This is from Forbes. This is your last free article. Well, let's hope not, because I'll use the Wayback Machine. Okay, this is from, when is it from? 2018, September 2018. It's titled, Scientists Admit, Embarrassingly, We Don't Know How Strong the Force of Gravity Is. There you go. They told you. They don't know. Even before Newton came along in the 1640s and 1650s, Italian scientists Francesco Grimaldi and Giovanni Riccoli, which, by the way, was a Jesuit, I think both of these were Jesuits, made their first calculations of the gravitational constant, meaning it was the first fundamental constant ever determined, even prior to Ole Romer's determination of the speed of light in 1676. So all of these things were coming out of the Counter-Reformation, folks. The first people to calculate, quote-unquote, calculate the gravitational constant were two Jesuits. That's all you need to know. Here's some fancy math to seduce you. Then, now there's the Einsteinian model of gravity coming from the warp of space, which is nonsense. Moving on. In the 1930s, G was measured to be 6 whatever numbers later refined in the 1940s to another big number, both by the scientist Paul Hale. As you might expect, the values got better and better through time. No, I would expect that if it's a constant, you measure it and it stays the same no matter what. With the uncertainties dropping from 0.1% to 0.04%. all the way down to just 0.012% in the late 1990s, owing mostly to the work of Barry Taylor. In fact, if you pull out an old copy of the Particle Data Group booklet, where they give the fundamental constants, you can find a value of for G in those books, and it gives you the value with an uncertainty of about 0.00085. But then something funny happened. So all of this research that supposedly got better and better and more accurate and blah, 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 something funny happened. Later that year, experiments that were performed indicated a value that was inconsistently high with those values. Gives you the value. Multiple teams using different methods were getting values for G that conflicted with each other at 0.15% level, more than 10 times the previously reported uncertainties. How did this happen? Oh no, they're panicking. About 10 years ago, all this happened. And of course, they had to spin it like crazy. Here's the Cavendish thing again with the torsion wire, blah, blah, blah. It is strongly suspected that one of the major factors at play was the well-known psychological factor of confirmation bias. You don't say. This entire thing is about confirmation bias. If all of your colleagues are getting measurements, blah, 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 you might reasonably expect to get something like another number, but if you got something like a number that was different, you'd probably assume you did something wrong. You'd look for possible sources of error until you found one, and you'd perform the experiment again and again until you got something reasonable, something that was at least consistent with the previous measurements. This is why it was such a shock in 1998 when a very careful team got a result that differed by a spectacular 0.15% from the previous results, when the errors on those earlier results were claimed to be more than a factor of 10 below that difference. What does that tell you about the previous measurements, by the way? That's an important point that they don't state. Because they were so confident those that were right and you're getting better, and suddenly you have a measurement that's completely off. Like, what does that tell you if it's a constant? NIST responded by throwing out the previous stated uncertainties, and values were suddenly truncated to give at most 4 significant figures with much larger uncertainties attached. So they hid it behind some math. Torsion balances and torsion pendulums, both inspired by the original Cavendish experiment, continuing to lead the way in the measurements of gravity, outpacing the more recent technique of atom interferometry experiments. In fact, just last week, a team from China claimed to get the most precise measurement of gravity yet from 2 independent measurements, and gives you the numbers with uncertainty of just 11 parts per million on each. If you believe this stuff, really, I mean, China recently claimed to put a little robot on the moon. Do you believe that? They're not going to the moon. They've gotten inducted into the secret society of making money off of space. These values may agree with one another to within 2 standard deviations, but they don't agree with other measurements performed by other teams over the past 15 years. Exactly. What does that tell you? Which range from as high as blah, blah, blah and as low as blah, blah, blah. While the other fundamental constants are known to precisions of anywhere between 8 and 14 significant digits, uncertainties are anywhere from thousands to billions of times greater when it comes to gravity. Because you're not measuring gravity. You're measuring probably something electromagnetic. Who knows what they're measuring, to be honest with you, if they're measuring anything at all. The gravitational constant of the universe, G, was the first constant to ever be measured, yet more than 350 years after we first determined its value, it is truly embarrassing how poorly known compared to all the other constants our knowledge of this one is. That's because it's probably not a constant like electromagnetic constants and electricity and all these things that we can measure and use. We use this constant in a whole slew of measurements and calculations, from gravitational waves to pulsar timing to the expansion of the universe. That's right. What does it mean if your measurement for gravity is 10 times more than it was before? What does that mean for the entire model? Think about it. Yet our ability to determine it is rooted in a small-scale measures made right here on Earth. So again, they play the relativist card. Keep that in mind. The tiniest sources of uncertainty, from the density of materials to seismic vibrations across the globe, can weave their way into our attempts to determine it. Oh, you don't say, I wonder if that affected Cavendish's experiment. Huh. It's funny. Maybe we should go back and check that. Until we can do better, there will be an inherent, uncomfortably large uncertainty anywhere the gravitational phenomenon is important. It's 2018, and we still don't know how strong gravity actually is. And they admit to you that there's so many problems with seismic vibrations, with so many things going on. The world is a complex concert of energy. And that's true. So the question is, if you admit this, and you're fumbling with something that is so central to your model, and you're still basing it on a guy from 300-400 years ago with some lead balls and some simple machines, that supposedly measured all of these things. I mean, come on. It's just like Eratosthenes with the sticks. It's just like the moon landing, and then now they have the Mars rover. It's just version 2.0. There's always the next thing that just repackages the old lie and does another show. It's a show. The world is a stage, folks. The world is a stage. This is from semanticscholar.org. The Newtonian gravitational constant, recent measurements and related studies. And I think I highlighted I just had the introduction here. Improvements in our knowledge of the absolute value of the Newtonian gravitational constant G have come very slowly over the years. Most other constants of nature are known, and some even predictable, to parts per billion or parts per million at worst. However, G stands mysteriously alone, its history being that of quantity, which is extremely difficult to measure and which remains virtually isolated from the theoretical structure of the rest of physics. I wonder why. Several attempts aimed at changing this situation are now underway, but the most recent experimental results have once again produced conflicting values of G, and in spite of some progress and much interest, there remains to date no universally accepted way of predicting its absolute value. That means that you don't have a model, my friends. If you're honest, you don't have a model, because if you don't know what the value of G is, how can you possibly predict a heliocentric model where planets are dependent upon a particular force of gravity and orbits and things like that? How can you have a model when you don't know what the fundamental thing is that is gluing that model together? This review will assess the role of G in physics, examine the status of attempts to derive its value, and provide an overall view of experimental efforts that are directed at increasing the accuracy of its determination. Regarding the latter, emphasis will be placed on describing the instrumentational aspects of the experimental work. Related topics that are also discussed, blah, 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 and it just kind of goes on in some scientific jargon. But this is the point. This is from 1997, actually, very early on. So they've been struggling with this for the last 20 plus years. This is from the Newtonian Gravitational Constant and Index of Measurements, 1983, by George T. Gillies. Bureau of International Depoids of Measures and Standards, I'm guessing, pounds and standards, Pavillon de Berthoud in Severs, France. The Bureau of International Weights and Measures, I think, is what it is. It's in French, though. This is introduction. If one were to catalog the tools of precision measurement, an unusually high number of the listings would claim as their genesis the precision measurement of the Newtonian gravitational constant, herein simply referred to as G. These tools would include the torsion balance, the optical lever, the quartz fiber, synchronous detection techniques, ultra-high precision rotations, and many others. Yet G stands alone as the only fundamental constant currently known to little better than 1 part in 1,000, although there are 3 measurements claiming accuracies of 1 part in 10,000. So remember, the worst for a constant, for an actual constant, is 1 part in several millions. That's the worst. And with gravity, they can't get that certainty. I wonder why. In parallel with these efforts to measure the absolute value of G, there has also been a wide variety of experiments aimed at linking the gravitational force to the other forces of nature. All such efforts to date have had the singularly unique result of demonstrating that gravity indeed stands alone, the last of the great classical mechanisms in spite of its modernized presentation via general relativity. And we'll talk about general relativity. I have a whole section on the relativity gaslighting that they did through Einstein to basically cement the heliocentric model into the world and to basically hide the flaws behind it, behind relativism. That's basically what it is. One more little paragraph here. Classical gravitational physics has been like this, and foreseeably will continue to be like this. The reason why is that to this date, no one has succeeded in isolating sufficiently well the gravitational interaction between laboratory masses to the point where other disturbing forces or experimental uncertainties do not dominate the measurement. I'm going to read that again. The reason why is that, to this date, no one has succeeded in isolating sufficiently well the other disturbing forces or experimental uncertainties that would otherwise dominate the measurement, at least at levels above those at which other phenomena might be expected to occur. In other words, if you're admitting this in 1983 in an official scientific paper from the Institute of Weights and Measures, why don't you go back to Cavendish and say, how is it possible that Cavendish was able to rule out independent variables, right? That's the whole point. If you're trying to experiment on something, this is basic science, folks. You don't have to be a scientist to understand what's going on here. When you do an experiment, your goal as the scientist is to isolate an independent variable, right? Dependent variables and independent variables. You want to isolate everything. So you control everything as much as possible so that you can measure the one thing that you're trying to isolate. And the better your study is, the more it controls for variables. Well, you're trying to tell me that Cavendish from 300-400 years ago, with his rinky-dink lab and lead balls and contraption, was able to control all of the mysteries of the universe that we don't understand, like all this electromagnetic stuff, the forces, the vibrations, all the things that are happening that Tesla talked a lot about, by the way. And of course, Tesla believed that the minor attraction of masses could be explained through electromagnetism. And look what happened to Tesla. But anyway, that's a different story. The point is, when you admit this, if you're honest as a scientist, you would go back and say that there's no way that we can take Cavendish's experiment as anything but just something happened. Okay, well, the next thing to do is to investigate it, not to take it as absolute fact that he measured gravity and that he measured the density of the Earth or the mass of the Earth or whatever. Nonsense. When he couldn't control anything, he didn't control for anything. How could he have controlled for anything when we're discovering so many new things and they're not even to be able to measure gravity because of this problem? Supposedly gravity, because again, I don't believe in gravity. But this is from News Scientist. Let's see. Is it going to load? Okay, here we go. Strength of gravity. This is also from Internet Archive. I had to go to the Wayback Machine because I think they took it down. But strength of gravity shifts, and this time it's serious, from 2013. Did gravity, the force that pins us to the Earth's surface and holds stars together, just shift? Maybe, just maybe. The latest measurement of G, the so-called constant that puts a figure on the gravitational attraction between two objects, has come up higher than the current official value. Well, if you were honest, that means your whole model falls apart. Measurements of G are notoriously unreliable. So the constant is in permanent flux and the official value is an average. However, the recent deviation is particularly puzzling as it is at once starkly different to the official value and yet very similar to a measurement made back in 2001. Not what you would expect if the discrepancy was due to random experimental errors. So sometimes they're getting it super high, sometimes they get it super low. One result contradicts 15 years of measurements, then another one agrees with that one. It's just they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're looking at. And they're trying to package it as gravity because otherwise the whole model falls apart. It's possible that both experiments suffer from a hidden persistent error, but the result is also prompting serious consideration of a weirder possibility. The gravity itself can change. That's a pretty radical option, but if correct, it would take us a step closer to tackling one very big mystery, dark energy, the unknown entity accelerating the expansion of the universe, i.e., there's no expansion of the universe, folks. But in order for that to exist, they have to make up things like dark energy, and they have to misinterpret redshift, and we'll talk about all this stuff, I promise you. But this is all conjecture, folks. Do you see how much nonsense this article from 2013 is? The natural scientific response is, okay, obviously this calls into question everything. We need to reevaluate, because if gravitation is supposed to be a constant, then you can't just change it by a factor of 10. And say, oh, I guess it increases. Oh, I guess it fluctuates. Well, if it fluctuates, your whole model falls apart. How do you even measure something like that? How do you have any model that comes together after a Big Bang if gravity fluctuates? If the Big Bang, first off, it doesn't make any sense that there's gravity. Gravity is dependent upon mass. And when you have the Big Bang, matter is at its highest entropy state. Do you understand? Meaning it's in the most disorder possible because an explosion just happened. That's not what happened, but let's just go with the Big Bang and see how stupid this is. When the Big Bang happened, you have everything spread out evenly, just hydrogen atoms, right? You tell me, how is it possible that gravity coalesced these things into planets and other things like asteroids? How is that possible? When gravity, the force of gravity relies on their existing a bunch of mass already put together. So that doesn't make any sense. Now you're adding another layer of absurdity to it that you can say, well, maybe gravity is fluctuating. Well, if it fluctuates, then it would have never come off the ground. What is the odds of something exploding, coming back together, and then while it's coming back together, it could also have the probability of fluctuating, meaning getting weaker in force, so disassembling and then coming back. I mean, it is total, absolute nonsense to believe this because it's conjecture. But this is what people believe. And then you talk to them and you say gravity doesn't exist. Oh, you're stupid. You're an idiot. Like, what are you, born 600 years ago or whatever, which is just, it's so sad. It's so sad. The most scientific thing you can do is to question what you've been told. There's nothing wrong with that. This is from the Royal Society. Publishing Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, blah, blah, blah. The Newtonian constant of gravitation. A constant too difficult to measure. This is the thing that they were citing in that paper. Was it from Forbes? I forget when, but one of those articles we read recently. Just to read a little bit about it. The current spread of values is approaching a 0.05% or 500 parts per million, which is more than 10 times the uncertainties of each measurement. And it therefore appears that we know G only to 3 significant figures. This is very poor compared to other physical constants, many of which have uncertainties of the order of parts in 10 to the 8th. And the constant determining the electronic structure of atoms, the Rydberg, has an uncertainty of only 4 parts in 10 to the 12th, which is an enormous number, enormously significant number. Why is G so badly known? Why have recent experiments given such widely different results, and how should we proceed now to resolve the problem? These were the questions addressed at the meeting held on the 27th and the 28th February 2014, of which the papers in this issue of the Philosophical Transactions are the proceedings. So they document the paper and so on. So they're panicking. They're panicking just like they did with the 2017 eclipse, because these things are like, uh-oh, the whole model's falling apart now that we have the internet and so on and so forth, and it's much easier to debunk. And of course, they need to work their propaganda much harder to maintain the lie. This is from Futurism. Oh, what is this? Oh, here we go. Sometimes it goes to the bottom for some reason. Is the gravitational constant really constant? So you go. There you go. That's how the enemy resolves the problem. Well, it's just fluctuating. It must be just relative. And of course, you can hide behind relativism all day. Therefore, when trying to measure it, the forces... Oh gosh, what is this? Leave me alone. I don't want to sign up for your thing. I do not want to be in your transhumanist movement. Therefore, when trying to measure it, the other forces can cause systematic errors. It is akin to trying to measure the weight of a feather outdoors in a slight breeze with an old pair of scales. The first thought would be to try to remove the other sources of error. We do this by doing several different experiments and then averaging the results. We are not yet aware of a single perfect test to measure the gravitational constant. And yet Cavendish, you're going to tell me, figured out the mass of the Earth, and the Jesuits in the 1600s calculated the gravitational constant? Come on. Over the last century, nearly every time the gravitational constant has been measured, we've observed a different value. At first glance, you may think that means we're getting closer to its true value. However, it is hard to tell. It is currently uncertain as to whether the constant has actually been changing marginally over time or just compounding systematic errors. If it's been changing over time, what the heck does that tell you about your model, man? How can you have a model if the thing that glues it together, that you're relying on it to be the same, is constantly changing, or it's been changing since created? That makes no sense. But none of them are willing to admit that, because, I mean, you'll look like an idiot now if you believe in a flat Earth. Another theory is that there may be a correlation between dark energy and gravity. Again, dark energy these are conjectures, because they have to say that the universe is expanding. They have to. Otherwise, their model falls apart. Yet another theory states that the constant is always fluctuating around an average value, and that if we keep testing it over an even longer period of time, we will find the true average value. There you go. Just hide behind math. Hide behind math. It is nice to still have mysteries in the universe, things that we don't quite understand. Incredibly small changes in the gravitational constant can affect the rate at which stars form, their size, and how long they remain in the main sequence. Maybe we will never know for sure, remaining one of the universe's true mysteries. No, it's not a mystery. It's made up. And you're right, whoever wrote this, is that if you change the gravitational constant, then you change the speed at which stars form, which is a major problem, because the whole thing falls apart, folks. We'll talk about this just a second. One more. This is from pubs.aip.org, review of scientific instruments, invited review article, measurements of the Newtonian constant of gravitation. And I think I just had the abstract of this I was going to read. By many accounts, the Newtonian constant of gravitation is the fundamental constant that is most difficult to measure accurately. Over the past 3 decades, and this was published in 2017, same year as that eclipse, more than a dozen precision measurements of this constant have been performed. However, the scatter of the data points is much larger than the uncertainties assigned to each individual measurement, yielding a Burge ratio of about 5. Today, G is known with a relative standard uncertainty of 4.7 times 10 to the -5th, which is several orders of magnitude greater than the relative uncertainties of other fundamental constants. I.e., it's not a constant. It doesn't exist what they're measuring. In this article, various methods to measure G are discussed, a large array of different instruments ranging from the simple torsion balance to the sophisticated atom interferometer, blah, blah, blah. Some instruments, such as the torsion balance, can be used in several different ways, which is what Cavendish did, and they're still trying to work these false signs and wonders to convince the world that this is the case. In this article, the advantages and disadvantages of each instrument will be discussed. A narrative arc from the historical beginnings of the different methods to their modern implementation is given. Finally, the article ends with a brief overview of the current state of the art and an outlook. So there you go. They don't know left from right. So conclusion, Cavendish did not discover gravity and neither did Newton. These are people that are propped up by the beast because the beast controls education. The encyclopedia, the universities were made through Rome. The French Revolution, all the major scientists of the last 500 years were mostly Catholic, and Jesuits were lay people or clergy in some way. Not necessarily just Jesuits, but Jesuits have been all over the place. The beast has waged war over science to control science, because science is the atheistic thing that will then come to the light, and that's what's happening now with climate change, with the whole climate change thing being a moral issue. And we've talked about that in other videos as well. But they have no clue what they're doing, folks. They don't. Again, the first people to calculate the gravitational constant were 2 Jesuits, which tells you everything if you know your history about the Jesuits. Gravity doesn't exist. It cannot possibly exist. The idea of a force acting so selectively and breaking every known physical rule that we have, the first law of thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics, all these, it's never been measured. It's never been reproduced. It's just nonsense. It cannot possibly exist. You have to believe it, because without it, the heliocentric model falls completely apart. Gravity is supposed to be a constant, yet nobody can agree on it, and certainly the measurements are constantly all over the place. It's not like the actual constants that we have. Yet, their entire model involves this constant and is based on this constant. So gravity affects the whole thing. If gravity is dependent on mass, then consider the following. A change to the gravitational constant means a change to the mass that needs to happen in these various objects like the Earth, the Sun, and so on, and the Moon, which means a change in the size. Now, they could argue that they're more dense, but you can't really, certain things are objective, and so they have to increase the size if the gravity changes. Changing the size of the Sun changes the distance at which the Earth has to be away from the Sun. Do you get it? Because the angular size of the Sun is the same in the sky. Now, if you're saying it's much smaller or much bigger, you have to adjust the distance so that proportionally you can still explain the way it looks in the sky. Does that make sense? This is why math can hide anything. Math just shows you the proportion. When you look at the sun, you could see that and say, well, it's 50 miles away and it's like maybe 2 miles across. Or it's 1 billion miles away and it's 1 quadrillion miles across. You don't know what you're looking at. How do you know? If both of those relationships tell you the angular size, either of them could be correct, meaning very far and very large, or close, relatively close, and relatively small. You don't know what you're looking at. That's why math is used to do these spells, because math is about relationships. And this is the problem. If gravity changes, then the mass has to change, the size has to change. If the sun changes, for example, in size, then you have to change the distance at which is the Earth to keep the angular size the same, meaning how it looks in the sky. And then that changes the orbit of the Earth, the size of the orbit, which changes the year lengths and the seasons. And it also affects the age of the universe, the size of the moon, evolution. All these things are dependent upon this gravitational constant. Because again, if the speed at which stars form changes, then is the universe much younger? Is it much older? All this stuff depends on gravity for them. Not for me, because I don't believe in gravity, and certainly, hopefully you don't either. But gravity is a farce. And it cannot be that it's changing values all over the place. Anybody with any integrity in scientific thinking would realize that this is a farce. Your entire model is called into question now because it's based on an assumption, on a constant that can't even be measured or it doesn't even exist. Very, very stupid. Everything is related to everything, and when you have a system that you've created that's a mathematical system, which is what heliocentrism is, it's a conjecture, you can't just change the fundamental constant that ties it all together, because then everything percolates out from there. But nobody's ever mentioning this. You notice all these articles, they're trying to weasel their way. Well, maybe we just have to measure it over a period of time because it's actually fluctuating, or maybe it's just relative, and anything to just get your attention off the elephant in the room, that this is just nonsense. So they're going to try to apologize with all sorts of conjectures like dark energy, dark matter, relativity, which we'll talk about, mathematical issues and conjectures, anything to hide the truth. So don't buy into their spells. These are just spells that are done on your mind to make you think, oh, okay, well, it's like that. And you're giving your authority, you're giving your belief to an authority that isn't God. That's what this is about. It's about weaving all these little spells and tales. Oh, well, it's actually like this and like that and this, and you get swept up, wow, in this cosmological fairy tale designed to destroy your mind and to ultimately justify the beast taking over the world through a new world order, which is what you're seeing through the climate change agenda, through the false signs and wonders of NASA, of science fiction, of everything that they're using to bring the world into a common ideal. With globalism, you can't have globalism if you don't have a globe. But anyway, what are they measuring? What are they measuring? Well, I don't know. Who knows what they're measuring? There is enough evidence, even in their own writings, they say that, well, we can't, to this day, 2024, they do not have a way to measure gravity and measure it independent of all of the vibrational information that happens in the earth. They don't have a way to do that. So if they're admitting that to you themselves, and you have discoveries of magnetism, of attraction that are flipping everything we've known on its head, the logical conclusion is skepticism. That is, if you're honest, if you're simply honest with science, is skepticism. Gross and focused skepticism. And going back to people like Cavendish and saying, I don't know what you measure, but it's not gravity. We do live in an electromagnetic toroidal universe. Electromagnetism exists. Everything is energetic. It's vibrating. There's nothing New Age here I'm talking about. The New Age takes that information and creates a whole false way of saving yourself through it. But the reality is that the universe is very energetic. It's beautiful. We live in a toroidal scheme. Who knows how it works altogether, but everything is a toroid, right? The infinite, in fact, let me see if I can, let's find a picture. Pictures are always worth 1,000 words, right? Toroid. Images. Yeah, here's a toroid. Of course, these are, I'm trying to find a better, here we go, like something like this, you see? This is a toroid. So it's an infinite thing where the energy goes out and comes back in, goes out and comes back in. It's just infinite. And it keeps looping in on itself. And this is a reflection of the Creator, who is self-existent and who lives forever and is the source of all life and who attracts all things to him. The wicked are going to be attracted and destroyed, and the elect are going to be attracted and renewed. And who creates the world and so renews the world and so on. But toroid is everywhere. It's in magnetism. If you look, let's see if we can type in toroid nature. Because there's a graphic, I think, something like, you see like this kind of stuff. Here's an apple. You can kind of see. Let's see if I can use my fancy dancy. There you go. See that? Magnifying glass. So here's an apple as a toroid. Fruits are often in sort of energetic patterns, toroidal cymatic patterns. Like if you cut a banana in half or a pomegranate or whatever else, they have these energetic patterns, and they're often toroidal because this is the toroid. Goes out, comes back in, goes out, comes back in. Same thing with a tree. Of course, they superimpose this heliocentric nonsense on it. But trees are toroids. If you look at a tree, see, is it here? Do I see it? No. This is a good one. I think it has a tree. Let's see. Does it have a tree? Well, everything has this shape to it, right? There's all kinds of, like, you look at the pine cone, you look at all these, the ear has a little Fibonacci spiral. These are part of the universe, folks. I'm not saying anything, again, nothing New Agey or Gnostic or sacred geometry here, but the reality is that the universe is very well designed. That's one of the best arguments for God. And the tree, I was going to say, maybe we can type in a graphic for it. Trees are just toroids in slow motion. Toroid tree roots. Let's try that. Yeah, here we go. See? Toroid. In the middle, where the trunk is the middle of the toroid, and it goes poof, and it sprouts fruit and leaves and energy, and those leaves die eventually, and the fruit drops to the ground. The animals get it, they poop, and they fertilize the soil, the roots grow, they take up the nutrients, and they go back into the tree. And it goes like this cycle. And it's beautiful. It's an amazing thing. This is called a toroid. And this is everywhere. So toroid is part of the design of the world. And what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that there's more to this universe than we know. There's an electromagnetic component. There's an energetic component, the ether. We're going to look at in a future section here where people discovered the ether. Of course, ether has been known about for a while, and it's a medium that moves, and it moves light and so on. There's so many things to talk about and to discover. But most of these things that actually tell you the truth and that point you to the truth, like Tesla's discoveries, like we'll see some more experiments in the next section on the 1800s. A lot of experiments were done to prove the motionless Earth, to prove that the Earth isn't moving. But they are quickly taken over by the enemy, flipped around. Oh, no, that's not what's happening. This was happening, and they repackage it and propagandize it, and you get lost in the echo chamber. You have to realize that list that I went through of Catholic lay scientists and Catholic clergy scientists, the hundreds of people that have come out since the Counter-Reformation. You are in a Catholic echo chamber, folks. This is the matrix. Because, again, the devil has chosen the Catholic Church to give his power and authority and throne to. That means that for us, living in the end of the church age, the matrix to get out of is the Catholic matrix. Now, you may say, I'm not Catholic, I'm a Protestant. Well, think again. If you're a Protestant that goes to, not I'm saying you can go to church on any day of the week, but if you think Sunday is the day of rest, and you believe heliocentric cosmology, and you are an Arminian in your salvation theology, and you believe in an immortal soul that floats off to heaven after death, and you could talk to your relatives, maybe some people might have these experiences. All of this mentality is Catholic programming. This is the Catholic matrix. That's why I created a series on every major deception, because you need to get out of the Catholic matrix. And one of those things is cosmology. And that's a tough one for people. That's a tough one because socially it means, ooh, people are really going to call me an idiot. Well, you can't be friends with the world, folks. James says friendship with the world is enmity with God. And again, we know why the Catholic Church did what it did with Copernicus and Galileo, so that when it finally officially accepted those positions, it could demonize anybody that would still hang on to those old beliefs, which is the true beliefs, is that we live in a biblical cosmology situation, an enclosed universe with a flat plane, local light sources. How it looks altogether, I don't know. We'll speculate on that next time in the next installment of this series, but who knows? The point is that if gravity was a force, it would not behave selectively. It would not fluctuate constantly. It would not be impossible to measure and so on and so forth. If such a force existed that could bend the oceans and keep you on a ball spinning around through space at tens of thousands of miles an hour, but you can't measure it, I mean, that's just such gaslighting, and people believe it. So putting it all together, before we wrap this part up, the 1500s to the 1700s saw many important developments in cosmology. The Reformation prompted the beast to respond with the Jesuits, with Counter-Reformation, with counter-narratives, with science, infiltrating science and scientists all over the place, and eventually bringing people back to the Mother Church. Cosmology, as of the Reformation, became a priority for the beast, along with other things, to discredit the Bible and to ultimately discredit anybody operating by sola scriptura. The beast staged dramas with Copernicus and Galileo to make itself look good and eventually demonize anybody who is reading the Bible literally, which is exactly what's happening today. Like I said, even Answers in Genesis, who is all about creation and creationism, and they're all against evolution, but they believe in the Big Bang and redshift and expanding universe and Catholic cosmology. So that tells you everything about the state of Protestantism and the Counter-Reformation. Today, most Protestants have Roman Catholic cosmology, and they're ashamed of biblical cosmology. I hope that's not you. And again, I don't call myself a Protestant. I would say, if anything, a Protestant is protesting all of the Catholic Church's teachings. In that sense, I guess I consider myself a Protestant. But you got to get out of that denominational scheme. Nevertheless, I hope that's not the case with you. I hope that you are not ashamed of the Word of God. Regardless of how many questions it brings up, we trust that God is sovereign and that the Bible is true. Do they realize, people like Answers in Genesis, that heliocentrism is a Catholic belief system? Do they know everything I've covered for you today? And we're going to be covering quite a lot more. Do they realize that Satan gave his throne to the Catholic Church? Probably not. They're probably dispensationalists, and this is the problem. You see, the Catholic Church didn't just start to affect cosmology. It waged war on all fronts. Because if you are a dispensationalist or a premillennial, or you believe basically any version of the futuristic end times, what does that do? Or maybe you're a preterist. Who cares? Go to the right or to the left. I don't care. Just get off the narrow road. Get off the narrow road of history and recognizing the beast as the papacy. Because if you recognize that, then anything that comes out of the beast should be heavily scrutinized. But if the beast is not the Antichrist power on the earth, not the power that the devil gave his throne to, well, then there's nothing to worry about. Those friendly Jesuits are just contributing to science and helping us grow in scientific advancement for humankind. Do you see? Do you see why all these things are related and you have to protest everything? My venture is to say that these people in Answers in Genesis are probably dispensationalists, probably premillennials, maybe a few preterists. Guaranteed they're not historicists. I would be extremely surprised if they were historicists. Although you have people like the Seventh-day Adventists who are historicists. They talk about the beast all day. And yet they still believe in the heliocentric conspiracy. And Ellen White talks about other worlds and contacting other beings and all this stuff. And okay, well, if cosmology has been lied to me and we don't live on a ball spinning in space, then when Ellen White claims that she's a prophet and she's seeing visions from other worlds, she's actually communing with demons that are deceiving her, and she's not a prophet. You see the problem? But Adventists, as much as they pride themselves on exposing the Catholic Church, they've never divorced their mother. And that's why I made the series on Adventism, and you can go watch it. I love my Adventist friends, but you need to leave that denomination. You really do. You need to find a more biblical, correct, and narrow road to walk on, because that denomination, as of the time of this video, is coming to an end very rapidly. It's going to be integrated. But these people, they don't realize these things. Or maybe they do, and they're just Jesuit infiltrators. They don't realize that the Catholic Church is the beast. They don't realize that the Catholic Church has been waging war educationally since the Counter-Reformation, because it had to change position. They don't realize that all the major figures in heliocentrism, even before the Catholic Church took over and really kind of actualized all these things, were occultists. They were plain out occultists. And later, in the last 500 years, most of the figures in astronomy were Catholic. Whether they're lay or Jesuits doesn't matter. The Jesuits used the mystery religion principles to destroy the Protestant Reformation. The spherical earth, sun worship, the entire planetary system. Of course, again, the Bible doesn't talk to you about planets, it just says sun, moon, and stars. But the system, all worshiping the sun, and the sun being the center of that system, which is represented as a monad, if you remember, which is an occult symbol for the one, or Baal, or the sun, and so on. It's also a phallic symbol, as in the top of a penis. Gravity, as the mysterious force that holds everything together, is also another element of this, because there is the occult idea that you can influence reality with your thoughts and with incantations and with rituals. And that force, right? Just like in Star Wars, just like in, not so much Star Trek, but, Star Wars was all about the Force, which came out, right around this time, like 70s, 80s? I forget when the first Star Wars was out, but they've been going on for like decades now with all the revamps of it. just to keep that idea in people's minds. The force, there's this force. You got to use the force. And of course, it's a fairy tale on the front, but people believe these things, and it subconsciously programs them into a synergistic way of thinking, which of course, synergism is Rome's version of salvation. You have to do something. There's the force, and you have to, engage that force so you can create the outcome. That all together, what I just mentioned, a spherical earth, which is an occult idea, sun worship, and some mysterious force that holds all things together and is in all things, like a pantheistic kind of force that you can be one with and interact with. Now, quantum science, quote unquote science, is not really science, but quantum mechanics, which aren't really, you'll see, we're going to refute quantum mechanics. It sounds like, wow, that's going to sound really complicated. It's not. Quantum mechanics is just a sleight of hand that they did with wave mechanics and trying to maintain their heliocentric model, because quantum mechanics is needed. They need to make the light behave as a particle in an empty void. Because if you don't have that and light is a wave propagating through a medium, then you have the ether. And they had to get rid of the ether because the experiments proving that the ether existed also proved that the earth was the one standing still. And we'll get to that in a future section. But the point is this, folks. These things that we just talked about, like the spherical earth, sun worship, gravity, and so on, these would later lead to things like atheism, secularism, climate change, sci-fi, globalism, all these narratives that would justify a new world order under the beast, which you are seeing come to coalescence now, which is the whole climate change narrative. Oh my gosh, we're going to get hit by an asteroid. We need to unite the world and create this thing to destroy it. And it's just, again, you'll see as we get closer and closer to the current age, how all these things shape up in an ecumenical way. Remember, what does the Bible tell you? The world will marvel after the beast. That is the one and central aim of the devil. And if you know that, then you know where everything is going. Although it may not seem right now how this all ties together to ecumenism. Hopefully, if you do see it, then your ears are growing. But if you don't see it, just wait. You'll see exactly how all of these things lead back to Rome in an ecumenical way. The Jesuits made it their aim to change cosmology as one of the many threads against the truth, to ultimately separate people from God. God is not above you, as the Bible says. He's the Most High. Why is he the Most High? Because there's an objective reference point. Do you get it? There's no such thing as a Most High in a relativistic system. Where is God? In the heliocentric model. Why is he called the Most High? He's called the Most High because he's at the top. But at the top of a system that has an objective up and down. The heliocentric model doesn't have an objective up and down. So God is just kind of somewhere in space. And the farther away God is, the more of an atheist you can become. And if you're an atheist, then you're going to be nice and susceptible to the dark to light to come back to religion. So the idea of this was to bring the world back to the mother church, to separate people from God so that the church could place itself in between that as the Antichrist power through the man of sin to basically offer you a counterfeit salvation. This is brilliant, folks, through the mystery religion, through the New Age, through religion, through all the things, the NAR, all the things that you're seeing now. Nobody would accept the Catholic Church if they knew the history of the Jesuits, if they knew the profoundly occult origins of heliocentrism, if they knew all these shenanigans. But most people don't. And most people don't have the patience or the desire to look through the information like we're doing today. But again, this is why if you want a true biblical faith, you need to reject all of Rome's teachings, all of them. There's no halfway, because if Rome is not going to get you with cosmology, they'll get you with Sunday as the day of rest, or they might get you with the immortal soul, or they might get you with synergistic thinking, or whatever else. The devil has many tentacles through his beast system, and you need to be aware of all of them. History proves the Catholic Church has been the main influencer of cosmology and heliocentrism in the last 500 years. And if the Bible tells you that the Catholic system is the beast that is going to receive worship, what does that mean? Do you see how understanding your end times is critical to understanding cosmology? Interestingly enough. History proves that the Bible is true, that Satan chose the Catholic Church to weave all of his deceptions into one cohesive paradigm and bring it to the world through things like the false prophet, through all these various things we're talking about. Now, the next big development in history was the banning of the Jesuits and the French Revolution. The French Revolution is when the final political system which is this woman riding the beast, the union of church and state, the union of the two parties emerged. I talk about this quite a bit in my End Time series, so go watch that, because the beast that the woman rides is the beast that emerges from the bottomless pit and kills the two witnesses in 1798. So that means that in 1798, when this two-party system of communism and religious nationalism emerged, this dialectic, that system, this final system, which is what also killed the two witnesses, is what is going to reconcile in the ultimate manifestation of the New World Order. And you're seeing that now. These two opposites are coming head to head. More and more, the king of the north, king of the south, king of the north. And pretty soon what does the Bible tell you is the king of the north rushes on the king of the south and takes all his stuff. And we're coming to the capstone of the Illuminati pyramid. So I talk about this quite a bit. I won't talk about it too much, but why this is important is that the 1800s, as a result of the French Revolution, 1798 was when the Pope was arrested. French Revolution started a little bit before that, but by the 1800s, you had a whole century, 1800s and 1900s till today, were waves and waves of satanic activity. Now you've seen the overall view of the Catholic Church's involvement in the last 500 years. You saw the Counter-Reformation and how the Catholic Church weaponized the occult knowledge that it had into basically disseminating into the world everywhere. The Jesuits were in China, they were in Japan, they were everywhere, disseminating this information and shaping culture actively, because that's what they do. And they're doing it today very quickly. So with that out of the way, then you had things like the Enlightenment and all the things that happened in the 1800s and the 1900s, which we're going to be talking about in the next section. Understanding the evil that came out of the French Revolution with the beast from the bottomless pit and so on, and how we got here today is our key focus with the next section. So onward into part 3, secularism, 1800s and 1900s.